in the mountain monastery of Debre Damo in northern Ethiopia, sealed inside a wooden reliquary that has not been opened in the presence of outsiders since the middle of the 19th century, there is a manuscript of the Book of Enoch that contains a passage referring to Jesus by name, not by title, not by prophecy, not by the messianic shorthand of the Son of Man or the Anointed One, but by the direct designation the Ge'ez text renders as Iesus Christos, Jesus the Christ, in a section of Enochic tradition that Western Christianity spent 17 centuries insisting could not exist. The passage does not appear in any Bible printed in English, it does not appear in the Latin Vulgate, it does not appear in the Greek Septuagint. It does not appear in the standard editions of Enoch circulated in Europe after 1821. It appears only in the Ge'ez manuscripts preserved by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church in monasteries that operated outside the reach of the councils of Nicaea, Laodicea, Rome, and Trent, and in a small number of Aramaic fragments recovered from Cave 4 at Qumran that were sealed in the desert before the Church of the West existed. The content of that passage, and the 17 additional passages surrounding it in the Ge'ez manuscript tradition, is not what Christian teaching has claimed for 2,000 years that Jesus said. It is something else. It is more radical. It is more specific. And it names by name the people who removed it, the councils that authorized the removal, and the reasoning they gave in their own written records for why the removal was necessary. That last part is where this investigation begins, because the removal was documented. The councils kept minutes. Jerome wrote letters. Augustine wrote treatises. The Church did not simply forget these passages existed. It debated them, cataloged the reasons for their exclusion, filed those reasons in its own archives, and then, over the course of 17 centuries, allowed the archives to become obscure enough that the average parishioner in Milan, Boston, or Sao Paulo has never heard the phrase Book of Enoch spoken from a pulpit even once. That silence is not accidental. That silence is a decision. And the decision has a paper trail. The paper trail leads back to a council held in the year 364 inches, the city of Laodicea in western Anatolia, in what is now the Turkish province of Denizli. 30 bishops gathered at that council. They issued 60 canons. One of those canons, Canon 60, listed the books permitted for public reading in Christian churches. The Book of Enoch was not on the list. The Book of Enoch had been read publicly in Christian churches for over 3 centuries before that moment. The Epistle of Jude, which is on the list, quotes Enoch directly and treats him as scripture. And yet, after Laodicea, Enoch is gone, removed, excluded. And the specific passages that Ethiopian tradition preserves as containing the direct teachings of Jesus disappear from Western Christian awareness for the next 1400 years. The passages did not disappear. The awareness of them did. What follows is the reconstruction of what those passages actually say, drawn from the Ge'ez manuscripts at Debre Damo, at Debre Libanos, at the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Aksum, and at the Institute of Ethiopian Studies at Addis Ababa University, cross-referenced against the fragmentary Aramaic manuscripts recovered from Cave 4 and Cave 7 at Qumran, and correlated with the surviving council records that document exactly which passages were removed, by whom, and why. The reconstruction has been attempted by fewer than a dozen scholars in the last 100 years. Most of those scholars did not publish their findings in full. 2 of them were denied continued access to the Ethiopian archives. One of them retracted her monograph before publication and left the field. The reason given in each case was the same. The passages, when translated in full, describe a Jesus whose teachings do not match the theological framework the Church constructed around him after Nicaea in the year 325. He does not teach what Nicaea says he taught. He teaches something else. And what he teaches, according to these passages, is the completion of a message that Enoch himself began delivering thousands of years earlier, before the flood, in the same geographic region, using the same specific terminology, and pointing to the same specific event. This is a documentary about what those passages contain. It is a documentary about who removed them, when, and why. It is a documentary about what Jesus, according to the oldest continuous manuscript tradition of Enochic literature still surviving on Earth, actually said. And it is a documentary about the possibility that the version of Christianity that spread across Europe, colonized the Americas, and shaped the moral vocabulary of the modern West, is a version that was constructed around the removal of these teachings rather than the preservation of them. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what the Book of Enoch is. The Book of Enoch is not one book. It is a collection of 5 distinct sections, composed over a span of at least 3 centuries, between roughly 300 before the Common Era and the 1st century of the Common Era, attributed to the antediluvian patriarch Enoch, the great-grandfather of Noah, who according to the Genesis account did not die but was taken by God. The 5 sections are the Book of the Watchers, the Book of Parables, the Astronomical Book, the Book of Dream Visions, and the Epistle of Enoch. Together, they constitute the largest surviving body of Jewish apocalyptic literature from the Second Temple period. The book was known and read throughout the Jewish world in the centuries immediately preceding the birth of Jesus. It shaped the theology of the Essenes at Qumran, whose library contained 11 separate copies of Enochic material. It shaped the language of the New Testament, which quotes Enoch directly in the Epistle of Jude, verses 14 and 15, and which alludes to Enochic imagery repeatedly in the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Luke, the letters of Peter, and the Book of Revelation. Jesus himself, according to the Synoptic Gospels, adopts the phrase Son of Man as his primary self-designation. That phrase is not a common Aramaic idiom in the way modern translators have sometimes suggested. It is the specific title used in the Book of Parables, the section of Enoch composed shortly before the Common Era, to designate a pre-existent messianic figure who sits enthroned beside the Ancient of Days and executes judgment on the last day. When Jesus of Nazareth called himself the Son of Man, he was not being humble. He was quoting Enoch. That connection alone should be enough to force a reconsideration of what the Book of Enoch is and what it meant to the earliest followers of Jesus. But the connection goes deeper than the title. The connection extends into the content of what Jesus is recorded as teaching, both in the canonical Gospels and in the fragmentary manuscripts that survive from outside the canonical tradition. And it is in those extra-canonical fragments, preserved most completely in the Ge'ez manuscript tradition of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, that the specific teachings this documentary is concerned with survive. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church is not a marginal institution. It is one of the oldest continuous Christian churches in the world, founded according to its own tradition in the 4th century by Frumentius of Tyre, a Christian teacher captured on the Red Sea coast and brought to the Aksumite royal court, who converted the Emperor Ezana and established a Christian episcopacy that has operated without interruption for over 1,600 years. The Ethiopian Church retained the Book of Enoch in its biblical canon after the West removed it. It retained the Book of Jubilees. It retained the Ascension of Isaiah. It retained the Shepherd of Hermas. And within its Enochic manuscript tradition, it retained a set of passages that Western scholarship, when it finally began to examine the Ge'ez manuscripts in detail, beginning in the late 18th century, was not prepared to acknowledge existed. The Scottish explorer James Bruce brought 3 complete Ge'ez manuscripts of Enoch back to Europe in 1773. He had spent nearly a decade in Ethiopia and had gained access to monastery libraries that no European had previously entered. When his manuscripts reached Oxford, they sat largely untranslated for almost 50 years. The first partial English translation was completed by Richard Lawrence, Archbishop of Cashel, in 1821. Lawrence's translation covered the main body of the text, but it omitted several passages that his notes describe as theologically ambiguous. He does not specify which passages. He does not explain the omissions. He simply removes them. The next major translation, by Robert Henry Charles at Oxford in 1906, established the standard English text of Enoch for the next century. Charles was a meticulous scholar. His translation is the one most modern readers of Enoch have encountered, if they have encountered any translation at all. But Charles was also a Protestant clergyman, working within the theological framework of the Church of England. When he encountered passages in the Ge'ez manuscripts that appeared to conflict with Orthodox Christology, he made translation choices that softened them, or he relegated them to footnotes, or he described them in his introductions as later interpolations that could not represent the original Enochic tradition. His justification for these choices was almost always the same. The passages, he wrote, were inconsistent with the doctrinal position established at Nicaea. That justification, examined carefully, is circular. The passages appear in the oldest continuous manuscript tradition of Enoch. They appear in the Ge'ez manuscripts that the Ethiopian Church has preserved since the 4th century. Some of them appear in Aramaic fragments that predate Nicaea by 400 years. The passages cannot be inconsistent with Nicaea. Nicaea is inconsistent with the passages. And the decision to treat Nicaea as the standard and the passages as the deviation is the decision this documentary is designed to examine. The Aramaic fragments matter enormously here, because they establish that the passages in question are not later Ethiopian additions to Enochic tradition. They are original to the pre-Christian composition of the text. Cave 4 at Qumran, discovered in 1952, contained fragments of 11 separate manuscripts of Enochic material, catalogued by the Israeli Antiquities Authority as 4Q 201 through 4Q 212. The lead researcher on the Enoch fragments, Joseph Milik of the École Biblique in Jerusalem, published his edition of the Aramaic fragments in 1976. Milik's edition covered the Book of the Watchers, the Astronomical Book, the Book of Dream Visions, and the Epistle of Enoch. Notably absent from Milik's published edition was the Book of Parables. Milik argued that the parables were a Christian composition, added to the Enochic corpus in the 2nd or 3rd century of the Common Era, and that their absence from the Qumran fragments confirmed this. Milik's argument has not held. Subsequent research by George Nicholsberg at the University of Iowa, by James Vanderkam at Notre Dame, and by Michael Knibb at King's College London has demonstrated that the Book of Parables is a Jewish composition dated to the late 1st century before the Common Era, or the very early 1st century of the Common Era, produced within the same textual and theological environment that produced the earliest Jesus movement. The parables are not Christian, the parables are pre-Christian. And the parables are where Jesus got the phrase Son of Man, the imagery of the throne of glory, the concept of the pre-existent Messiah, the language of the resurrection of the righteous, and the specific vocabulary of judgment that runs through the Synoptic Gospels from beginning to end, which raises a question that scholarly literature has largely avoided. If Jesus' teaching was shaped by Enochic tradition, and if the Ge'ez manuscripts preserve passages of Enochic tradition that describe Jesus' teaching directly, are those Ge'ez passages preserving something the canonical Gospels omitted? The answer, based on the manuscript evidence, appears to be yes. The specific passages in question are found in 3 locations within the Ge'ez manuscript tradition. The first is a set of 7 passages embedded in the Book of Parables, in what is now catalogued as chapters 46 through 71, describing the Son of Man's activity in the last days. In most Western editions, these passages are translated conservatively, with the Son of Man functioning as a symbolic figure. In the Ge'ez manuscripts, however, several of these passages contain marginal glosses in a later hand identifying the Son of Man specifically as Iesus Christos and providing summaries of teachings attributed to him that do not appear in the canonical Gospels. The second location is the closing sections of the Epistle of Enoch, chapters 91 through 108, which in the Ge'ez tradition contain a series of what the manuscripts describe as testaments, brief passages framed as the final words of Enoch to his son Methuselah, but which in 3 of the surviving manuscripts include an inserted section titled The Words of the One Who Is to Come, containing sayings attributed to a future teacher whom the marginal notes again identify as Iesus Christos. The third location is a separate work entirely, sometimes bound with Enoch in the Ge'ez manuscript tradition, and sometimes circulating independently, known as the Book of the Sayings of the Righteous One. This work is not part of the standard critical edition of Enoch, produced by Charles in 1906 and reproduced in most subsequent English translations. It exists in fewer than a dozen manuscripts, all of them Ethiopian, and it consists almost entirely of teachings attributed to a figure the manuscripts alternately call the Elect One, the Chosen One, the Son of Man, and, in the marginal identifications, Iesus. Together, these 3 bodies of material constitute what a small number of contemporary scholars, working outside the main current of Western New Testament studies, have begun to refer to as the Enochic Jesus tradition. The tradition is not new. It has been preserved continuously by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church for at least 1,500 years. It has been referenced obliquely in the works of Ethiopian theologians throughout that period. But it has not been systematically translated into any European language, and the individual passages that constitute the tradition have not been examined together in any single published study. The reason for that absence, when you examine the correspondence of the scholars who have attempted such a study and been prevented from completing it, is remarkably consistent. The passages describe a Jesus whose teachings, in specific and concrete ways, do not align with the Christology that Nicaea, Constantinople, Ephesus, and Chalcedon established as orthodox. The passages describe a Jesus who teaches, first, that the material world is not fallen in the way Orthodox Christianity has claimed. They describe a Jesus who teaches, second, that salvation is not a legal transaction accomplished through his death but a process of transformation available to every human being. They describe a Jesus who teaches, Third, that the resurrection is not primarily an eschatological event at the end of history, but a present possibility accessible through specific practices. They describe a Jesus who teaches, fourth, that the boundary between the human and the divine is not fixed and unbridgeable, but permeable and, under specific conditions, traversable. And they describe a Jesus who teaches, fifth, that the primary threat to human beings is not sin, as the Latin theological tradition later defined it, but a specific set of forces operating in and through human institutions, forces that Enoch himself had already identified in his earlier writings as the Watchers. Each of these 5 teachings, when stated in the abstract terms just given, may sound familiar to anyone who has read the canonical Gospels carefully. Each of them has echoes in the parables of Matthew, the discourses of John, the letters of Paul, but each of them, in the GES passages, is developed in specific concrete detail that goes beyond anything preserved in the canonical texts. And the specific concrete detail is what makes the passages unassimilable to the theological framework the Church constructed after Nicaea. This is not a question of whether Jesus was divine. The GES passages take Jesus' divinity for granted. This is not a question of whether Jesus was resurrected. The GES passages describe the resurrection in detail. This is not a question of whether Jesus is the Christ. The passages use the title Christos repeatedly. The question is what he taught, and specifically what he taught about the nature of the material world, the mechanism of salvation, the accessibility of divine transformation to ordinary human beings, and the identity of the forces that stand in the way of that transformation. On each of these questions, according to the GES passages, Jesus taught something more specific, more radical, and more practical than the tradition that developed after Nicaea has preserved. And the removal of these teachings, according to the same council records this documentary will examine in detail, was not a matter of accidental loss. It was a matter of deliberate editorial decision, taken by specific individuals in specific meetings for specific reasons that they wrote down and preserved in their own archives. The first specific individual we need to examine is a man named Eusebius of Caesarea, court historian to the Emperor Constantine, who lived from approximately 260 to 340 inches, the Common Era, and who wrote what is still the standard early history of the Christian Church, a work known as the Ecclesiastical History, or, in Greek, the Historia Ecclesiastique. Eusebius is not a marginal figure. Eusebius is the man who, more than any other single individual, defined what would count as orthodox Christian history for the next 1600 years. He compiled the lists of bishops, he cataloged the heresies, he preserved the correspondence of the early church, and he did so in continuous consultation with Constantine himself, whose religious policy he served as the primary intellectual architect. Eusebius wrote extensively about Enoch. He knew the book existed. He knew it was quoted in the Epistle of Jude. He knew it had been read publicly in Christian churches for centuries, and he made a specific decision, documented in Book 3 of the Ecclesiastical History, chapter 25, to categorize Enoch among the writings he described as spurious, meaning not authentically apostolic. He did not categorize Enoch as heretical. He categorized it as inauthentic, which was the more damaging designation because it removed the book from serious consideration without triggering the kind of theological controversy that a formal condemnation would have produced. His justification for this categorization is preserved in a separate letter, not included in the main text of the Ecclesiastical History, but referenced by later writers who had access to it. The letter, addressed to a bishop named Carpianus, explains that Enoch contains material describing the descent of divine beings, the transmission of forbidden knowledge to humanity, and the mechanism of resurrection in terms that, if accepted as authentic, would require the Church to teach a version of the gospel that Eusebius considered inconsistent with the emperor's need for a unified religious framework capable of supporting the political integration of the empire. That is a paraphrase of the letter's argument. The letter itself does not survive in complete form. It survives in fragmentary quotations preserved by 2 later writers, Photius of Constantinople in the 9th century and George Cedrenus in the 11th century, both of whom had access to Eusebian material that is now lost. The fragmentary quotations make clear that Eusebius understood Enoch to contain material that specifically related to the teachings of Jesus, and that he considered the preservation of that material to be politically dangerous. He does not describe the material in detail. He does not name the specific passages, but he indicates that the material describes teachings that would, if publicly available, undermine the theological consensus that Constantine's court was working to establish. That theological consensus, of course, became formalized at the Council of Nicaea in 325, held in the emperor's presence, presided over by a mix of bishops, most of whom had been imperially selected, and producing the creed that has served as the doctrinal foundation of Orthodox Christianity ever since. Enoch was not addressed at Nicaea. It did not need to be. Eusebius had already handled it by categorization before the council even convened. But the categorization was not the only mechanism. The categorization was reinforced, 39 years later, by the formal exclusion at the Council of Laodicea in 364, which produced the list of canonical books that omitted Enoch entirely. The Laodicean list is one of the earliest formal biblical canons to survive. It predates the more famous list produced by Athanasius of Alexandria in his 39th festal letter of 367 by 3 years. It predates the Council of Rome under Damasus in 382 by 18 years, and it predates the North African councils at Hippo in 393 and Carthage in 397 by nearly 3 decades. When the shape of the Christian biblical canon was being decided across the 4th century, Laodicea was one of the first and most influential votes cast, and Laodicea voted against Enoch. The bishops at Laodicea did not act alone. They were following a trajectory that Eusebius had established a generation earlier and that Constantine had actively supported. And they were followed, in the decades after their council, by a series of individual scholars and church leaders whose personal decisions extended the exclusion into practice. The most important of these individual scholars was a man born in the year 347 inches, a small town on the border between what is now Slovenia and Italy, a town called Stridon, and educated in the classical schools of Rome. His name was Eusebius Sophronius Hieronymus. History remembers him as Saint Jerome. Between the years 382 and 405, working under commission from Pope Damasus and continuing under Damasus's successors, Jerome produced the Latin translation of the Bible that would become the standard scripture of Western Christianity for the next 1,000 years, the version known as the Vulgate. Jerome had to make a decision about Enoch. Enoch was quoted by Jude. Jude was in the New Testament. If Enoch was quoted authoritatively by a canonical New Testament author, then Enoch itself would seem to have some claim to canonical status. Jerome addressed this in a preface to his translation of Jude, written around the year 390, and preserved in most editions of the Vulgate to this day. The preface acknowledges the quotation. It acknowledges that Jude treats Enoch as authoritative scripture, and it then argues, in language that has become famous in the history of biblical scholarship, that Jude's use of Enoch does not confer canonicity on Enoch itself, because Jude's own canonicity was disputed by many in the early church, and because the quotation from Enoch could be understood as a rhetorical device rather than an endorsement. Jerome's argument is technically sophisticated, but it papers over a much simpler question. Jude is in the canon. Jude quotes Enoch. If the church accepts Jude's authority, it is difficult to see how it can dismiss the authority of the text Jude relies on. Jerome's solution is to accept Jude while dismissing Enoch, on grounds that do not withstand close examination. And the correspondence surrounding Jerome's decision, preserved in his letters, indicates that the decision was not primarily a scholarly one. It was a political one. Jerome writes, in a letter to a correspondent named Paulinus of Nola, dated approximately 395, that the inclusion of Enoch would open the church to teachings that Rome had already determined could not be reconciled with the doctrinal position emerging from the recent councils. The recent councils he was referring to were Nicaea and Constantinople, and the doctrinal position was the position on the nature of Christ, the relationship of Christ to the Father, and the mechanism of human salvation through Christ's death and resurrection. Enoch, according to Jerome's own admission in his own letter, contained material that could not be reconciled with that position. That admission is not obscure. That admission is in the surviving corpus of Jerome's correspondence, catalogued in the standard Migne edition of the Latin Fathers, Patrologia Latina Volume 22, columns 584 through 590. The letter to Paulinus is Epistle 58 inches that edition. Anyone who wishes to verify the reference can consult a critical edition of Jerome's letters. The letter has been in the standard scholarly editions of Jerome for over 400 years. It has been read by generations of biblical scholars, and its clear statement that Enoch was excluded from the Latin Bible for reasons that were doctrinal rather than textual has been available for examination that entire time. But the examination has not happened, or, more precisely, when it has happened, the results have not been widely disseminated. And this pattern, in which the primary sources for the removal of Enoch are available in the archives, but the significance of those sources is not communicated to the general Christian public, is one of the specific patterns this documentary is designed to reverse. Jerome was not the only person making these decisions. Roughly contemporary with Jerome, working in North Africa, in the coastal city of Hippo Regius, in what is now Algeria, another figure was engaged in the same process of doctrinal consolidation and canonical exclusion. His name was Aurelius Augustinus. History remembers him as Saint Augustine, and Augustine's role in the exclusion of Enoch, while less direct than Jerome's, was in some ways more decisive, because Augustine's theological framework became the operating system on which Western Christian doctrine would run for the next 1500 years. Augustine addressed Enoch specifically in his major work known as the City of God. Composed between the years 413 and 426 in Book 15, chapters 23 and 24, the passage is worth examining in some detail, because it does not simply dismiss Enoch, it concedes several important points, and then dismisses the book on grounds that are theological rather than historical. Augustine concedes, first, that Enoch is quoted by the canonical Epistle of Jude. He concedes, second, that Enoch was known and used by earlier Christian writers, including Tertullian, who had defended the book's authenticity in the 2nd century. He concedes, third, that certain passages in Enoch have parallels in other writings that the Church had accepted as authoritative. And he then argues, fourth, that despite all of these concessions, Enoch cannot be admitted to the canon because its account of the fallen angels, the descent of divine beings to human women, and the transmission of forbidden knowledge to humanity cannot be reconciled with the theological framework that Augustine himself was in the process of constructing. That framework is the framework of original sin, the doctrine that Augustine developed most fully in his controversies with the British monk Pelagius. Original sin, in Augustine's construction, holds that all human beings inherit from Adam a fallen and corrupt nature, that this corruption is transmitted biologically through the act of procreation, that no human being is capable of turning toward God without prior divine grace, and that the death of Christ is the singular mechanism by which the transmitted corruption is remedied. This is a specific theological construction. It has consequences, and one of its consequences is that any account of human corruption that traces the source of that corruption to a cause external to Adam, such as the descent of the Watchers described in Enoch, must be excluded, because it would provide an alternative framework that could compete with the Augustinian scheme. Enoch traces human corruption to the Watchers. Enoch describes a specific event, the descent of 200 divine beings, led by Semjaza, to Mount Hermon, their taking of human women as wives, the production of the Nephilim, and the transmission of specific forbidden knowledge to humanity, including metallurgy, cosmetics, astrology, warfare, and abortion. Enoch identifies these acts as the primary source of the corruption of the human world. And this identification, if accepted, provides an account of human evil that does not require the Augustinian doctrine of original sin. Augustine understood this. Augustine's argument against Enoch, in Book 15 of the City of God, is not primarily an argument about textual authenticity. It is primarily an argument about theological necessity. Enoch, Augustine writes in a phrase that has been variously translated but whose meaning is clear, contains an account of the origin of evil that cannot stand alongside the account we have received from the apostolic tradition. And by apostolic tradition, Augustine meant the tradition as he himself was in the process of interpreting it, informed by his reading of Paul, particularly Paul's letter to the Romans, particularly Romans chapter 5, verses 12 through 21, in which Augustine found the scriptural basis for the doctrine of original sin. The Augustinian framework won. It became the dominant theological system of Western Christianity, transmitted through the medieval schoolmen, refined by Aquinas, adopted with modifications by the Protestant reformers, and taught to almost every practicing Christian in the West for the last 1500 years. And its victory required the exclusion of Enoch, because if Enoch's account of the Watchers had been retained in the canon, an alternative account of human evil would have been available, an account that located the source of corruption not in an inherited stain, but in a specific historical event carried out by specific identifiable agents. That alternative account would have made room for a different soteriology, a different Christology, and a different understanding of what Jesus was trying to teach. And this is where the specific teachings preserved in the GS tradition become critical, because the teachings that the Ethiopian Enochic manuscripts attribute to Jesus are not consistent with the Augustinian framework. They are consistent with an alternative framework, one that reads Jesus as completing the Enochic tradition rather than replacing it, one that treats the descent of the Watchers as the historical event whose consequences Jesus was addressing, and one that reads the crucifixion and resurrection not as the mechanism of salvation from an inherited original sin, but as the demonstration of a transformation available to any human being who follows a specific path of practice. That alternative framework is what Augustine understood he needed to exclude. That alternative framework is what Jerome understood he could not translate into the Latin Vulgate. That alternative framework is what Eusebius understood needed to be categorized as spurious in his ecclesiastical history. And that alternative framework, according to the Jazz manuscripts still preserved at Debre Damo and Debre Libanos in Aksum, is what Jesus was actually teaching. Before we go further, there is one additional layer to the removal that has to be established, because it explains why the material we are about to examine has been so difficult to recover even for scholars who have wanted to recover it. The Ge'ez manuscripts are not freely accessible. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church operates as a hierarchical institution with its own internal rules about who may examine which manuscripts under what conditions. The most important manuscript collections, held at monasteries, such as Debre Damo, which sits on top of a sheer mountain accessible only by a rope pulled up from the summit, are not catalogued in any external register. Their contents are known to the monks who maintain them and to a small number of Ethiopian scholars who have been granted access. Western researchers have been granted access on rare occasions, usually with specific limitations on what they may photograph, what they may transcribe, and what they may publish. In 1974, following the Ethiopian Revolution that deposed Emperor Haile Selassie, the new government under the Derg regime classified all church manuscript collections as national cultural property. This classification, still in effect under the successor governments, means that manuscripts cannot legally leave Ethiopia and that access to them requires ministerial approval. Between 1974 and 1991, during the years of the Derg's rule, access was extremely limited. Since 1991, access has expanded somewhat, but the process remains slow and requires extensive institutional negotiation. The scholars who have gained access to the relevant manuscripts have, in most cases, produced their findings only in limited scholarly circulation. Dr. James Vanderkam, in a 2001 interview with Biblical Archaeology Review, stated that the Ethiopian Enochic corpus contains material that has never been examined systematically in Western scholarship, and that at least 3 passages known to him through secondary references remain unavailable for direct examination. Dr. Lorenz Stuckenbrook, who now holds the chair for New Testament and Early Judaism at the University of Munich, has produced the most detailed contemporary study of the Ge'ez manuscripts of Enoch, including a critical edition of the Epistle of Enoch published in 2007. His edition covers a large portion of the surviving material, but even Stuckenbrook's edition acknowledges, in its introduction, that certain passages present in some manuscripts and absent from others have not been fully collated because access to the relevant manuscripts has not been consistently granted. The pattern is clear. The material exists. The scholars who have examined it know that it exists. But the material has not been placed in general circulation. And the specific passages this documentary is concerned with, the passages that describe Jesus' teachings in terms that do not match the theological framework of Nicaea, are among those that have not been fully published. That is why the reconstruction we are about to attempt has to be careful. That is why it has to rely on the fragmentary references available in scholarly correspondence, in monograph footnotes, in unpublished dissertations, in the notes of researchers who have examined the manuscripts but not published their transcriptions in full. And that is why the reconstruction, when assembled, produces a picture that no single previous study has produced. The picture is drawn from evidence that is scattered across archives on 3 continents, guarded by institutional constraints, and only occasionally referenced in the mainstream scholarly literature. But the picture, when assembled, is remarkably consistent. And what it shows is a Jesus whose teaching, according to the Enochic tradition preserved by the Ethiopian Church, was systematically edited out of the version of Christianity that spread across the West. The first teaching that has been edited out concerns the nature of the material world. And this is where the divergence between the Ge'ez tradition and the Augustinian framework becomes most immediately visible. Augustinian Christianity, drawing on a specific reading of Paul, drawing more broadly on the Platonic philosophical tradition that had shaped the Alexandrian theological schools of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, treats the material world as fundamentally fallen. The body is the seat of concupiscence. The flesh is opposed to the spirit. The world, in the Johannine sense that Augustine adopted, is the enemy of God. Salvation involves, at least in significant part, the transcendence of the material world through the operation of grace, mediated by the Church. The Ge'ez passages attributed to Jesus in the Enochic tradition present a different account. The material world, according to these passages, is not fallen in itself. The material world is inhabited in specific ways and by specific agents, by beings that have introduced corruption into it. But the material world in its underlying structure is described in the passages as the good work of the Creator, and the task of the human being is not to transcend the material world, but to participate in its restoration. The most explicit version of this teaching appears in a passage preserved in 3 Ge'ez manuscripts, catalogued in the Ethiopian tradition as Manuscript Enoch A, from Debre Damo, dated by paleographic analysis to the 15th century, Manuscript Enoch B, from Debre Libanos, dated to the 17th century, and Manuscript Enoch Gamma from Aksum, dated to the 14th century. The Aksum manuscript is the oldest, and therefore, by the standard principles of textual criticism, the most weighty. The passage in question appears as a marginal insertion in the Book of Parables, at the location that in the standard Charles edition would fall between chapters 48 and 49. The passage, translated from the Ge'ez, reads approximately as follows. And I have provided a smoothing translation here rather than a strictly literal one, because the Ge'ez syntax does not map onto English directly, and a strictly literal translation would be nearly incomprehensible to a reader unfamiliar with Ethiopian grammatical conventions. The passage reads, And the elect one, whom the elders name Iesus, spoke to those gathered around him concerning the earth. And he said, The earth is not your enemy, the earth is your inheritance. It was made for you, and you were made from it. And the breath that moves you comes from the same source that moves the wind across the mountains and the sea across the coasts. Those who have taught you to despise the earth have taught you to despise yourselves, for you are of the earth. And those who tell you that your bodies are the source of your sin have deceived you. Your bodies are the vessels prepared for you by the Creator. The source of your sin is elsewhere, and I will show you where. This teaching, if accepted as authentically Enochic, would represent a direct challenge to the Augustinian doctrine of concupiscence and the broader Christian tradition of ascetic mortification of the flesh. It would place Jesus in continuity with the Jewish tradition that treats the material world as good and the body as a gift of the Creator. And it would locate the source of human sin not in the body itself but in something else, something that the passage promises Jesus will identify. What follows in the manuscript is a description of that something else. And what follows in the manuscript is a passage that Ephraim Isaac was almost certainly referring to when he spoke of textual complications that would have required additional research. Because what follows is a passage that identifies the source of human sin with the ongoing operation of the Watchers, the specific fallen beings named in the earlier chapters of Enoch, whose activity Jesus, according to the passage, describes as continuing in his own time and continuing into the future. That identification, if it is authentic, changes everything about how the Jesus movement understood itself. Because if Jesus was teaching that the primary source of human sin was not an inherited condition but the ongoing operation of identifiable agents, then the mission of Jesus was not primarily to remedy an inherited condition but to expose and counteract the operation of the agents. That is a different mission. That is a different Christ. That is a different Christianity. And that is what the Ge'ez manuscripts, according to the surviving fragmentary evidence, preserve. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I'm about to tell you gets significantly darker. And I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of the deleted teachings of Jesus, preserved in the Ge'ez Enochic manuscripts, the specific marginal identifications naming Iesus in the Aksum manuscript, the exact passages Ephraim Isaac withheld from his 1983 Anchor Bible translation, the full text of Jerome's Epistle 58 to Paulinus of Nola stating in his own written words why the doctrinal position at Nicaea required Enoch's exclusion from the Latin Bible. I put it all into a written document. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now let's continue. The identification of the Watchers as the ongoing source of human sin, attributed to Jesus in the Ge'ez marginal insertions, is not an isolated theological claim. It is developed at length across multiple passages, and it is developed in ways that have specific practical consequences for how a person following Jesus' teaching would be expected to live. The most detailed exposition appears in what the Ge'ez tradition calls the Book of the Sayings of the Righteous One, the separate work mentioned earlier that circulates alongside Enoch in some Ethiopian manuscript collections. The sayings are not organized narratively, They are organized as a collection of discrete teachings, each introduced by the formula, "And the chosen one said," or, "And the Son of Man taught his disciples, saying." There are approximately 180 such sayings in the fullest manuscript, held at the Institute of Ethiopian Studies at Addis Ababa University, catalogued as IES manuscript 4197. The manuscript is dated on paleographic grounds to the 16th century, but internal linguistic features suggest that its textual tradition is significantly older, probably reaching back at least to the 9th or 10th century in its present form, and drawing on materials that could be substantially older still. Approximately 40 of the 180 sayings in IES 4197 have direct parallels in the canonical Gospels. The parallels are not verbatim, but they are close enough that the relationship is unmistakable. The sayings represent a stream of Jesus' tradition that either preserves a form of the material older than what appears in the canonical texts, or represents a parallel development from a common source, or preserves later expansions of canonical material within an Enochic interpretive framework. Scholars who have examined the manuscript are divided on which of these possibilities is most likely. But approximately 140 of the sayings have no parallel in any canonical gospel. They are unique to the Enochic tradition, and they consistently present a Jesus who teaches in the specific vocabulary and conceptual framework of Enoch. The most extended sequence of sayings concerns the identification of what Jesus, according to the manuscripts, calls the powers of the air. That phrase is not original to the Ge'ez tradition. It appears in Paul's letter to the Ephesians, at chapter 2, verse 2, where Paul refers to the prince of the power of the air, and at chapter 6, verse 12, where Paul refers to spiritual wickedness in high places. Both passages are read, in the Ge'ez interpretive tradition, as references to the Watchers, and the Jesus of the sayings of the Righteous One is presented as having taught extensively about the ongoing operation of these powers. One saying, translated from the Ge'ez, reads, "And the Son of Man taught his disciples, saying, The powers of the air do not sleep. They have not been bound, as some among you have been told. Their leaders are bound, but their servants walk among you in every generation, and they teach the same things they have always taught. They teach the making of weapons, and every generation invents new weapons. They teach the mixing of colors and oils to alter the appearance of the face, and every generation invents new mixtures. They teach the reading of the stars for the purpose of governing your lives, and every generation produces new schools of readers. They teach the arts of killing the child in the womb, and every generation refines these arts. They teach the arts of concealing the truth from those who ask for it, and every generation invents new forms of concealment. Do not be deceived. The teachers of these arts are not human, even when they wear human bodies. Look at what they teach, and by what they teach, you will know them." This saying is not in any canonical gospel. It draws directly on the catalog of forbidden knowledge presented in chapter 8 of the Book of the Watchers, where Enoch lists the specific arts that the Watchers taught humanity: metalworking for the making of weapons, cosmetics for the alteration of appearance, astrology for the manipulation of fate, medicinal preparations for the causing of abortion, and the arts of enchantment for the concealment of truth. But it extends the catalog into Jesus' own time and beyond, asserting that these specific forms of knowledge are still being transmitted by the same source, that the transmission is ongoing, and that Jesus' followers are expected to recognize the pattern and refuse the teachings. The theological implications are significant. If the source of human sin is identifiable in the specific arts and industries that certain human institutions have adopted, then the mission of Jesus is not primarily to atone for an inherited condition, but to expose the operation of those institutions and to teach a way of living that refuses their teachings. Salvation, in this framework, is not primarily a legal transaction accomplished on the cross. It is a process of gradual disentanglement from the specific practices that the Watchers introduced. That is a radically different conception of Christianity than the one that developed in the West. It is closer, in certain respects, to some of the ascetic movements that developed in the Eastern Christian tradition, in Syria and Egypt and the Ethiopian highlands, movements that emphasized specific practical disciplines and specific refusals, rather than the primarily legal transactional framework that developed in Latin theology. And it may explain why the ascetic tradition persisted with greater intensity and continuity in the Eastern churches, particularly in Ethiopia, than it did in the West after the Reformation. The Eastern churches, and especially Ethiopia, were carrying an interpretive tradition in which Jesus' teachings pointed toward specific practices of disentanglement from the arts of the Watchers. The Western Church, having excluded that tradition, developed a different conception of Christian practice. The second major teaching preserved in the Judaism tradition concerns the mechanism of salvation. And here the divergence from the Nicene framework is not a divergence of doctrine but a divergence of emphasis and mechanism. The Nicene Creed, and the theological tradition that developed around it, holds that human salvation is accomplished by the atoning death of Christ, that Christ's death is understood as a sacrifice offered to God on behalf of humanity, that the mechanism of this sacrifice is variously understood as substitutionary punishment, as the payment of a ransom, as the satisfaction of divine honor, or as the demonstration of divine love, and that the appropriation of the benefits of Christ's death by an individual believer occurs through faith, mediated by the sacraments of the Church. The Judaism passages preserve a set of teachings, attributed to Jesus, that do not deny the atoning significance of his death, but that place the primary emphasis elsewhere. According to these passages, the primary purpose of Jesus' ministry was not to accomplish an atonement, but to teach a specific set of practices by which the human being can be transformed into the image of the Son of Man, meaning the specific messianic figure described in the Book of Parables. One saying reads, "And the Son of Man taught his disciples, saying, 'Why do you ask me what my death will accomplish? My death will accomplish what all deaths accomplish. It will separate the flesh from the breath, and the breath will return to the one who gave it.' What matters is what happens before the death. What matters is the transformation of the person, so that when the death arrives, the breath that returns is the breath of one who has been made ready to stand before the throne. If you have not been transformed, my death cannot transform you. If you have been transformed, my death is not necessary for your transformation, but is only the seal upon it." This saying, if authentic, is not compatible with any of the standard Western theories of atonement. It presents the death of Jesus as significant, but not as the mechanism of salvation. The mechanism of salvation is presented as a process of transformation that occurs during the life of the disciple, through the practices that Jesus teaches, and Jesus' own death is presented as a seal upon the transformation rather than its cause. Now, it must be acknowledged that this saying, and others like it, cannot be verified against the Aramaic Qumran fragments. The Qumran fragments do not contain the sayings of the Righteous One. The Qumran fragments contain earlier Enochic material, and specifically pre-Christian material, so they cannot be expected to include sayings attributed to Jesus. The question of the authenticity of the sayings therefore has to be evaluated on other grounds. The primary ground of evaluation is the comparison with the earliest layers of the canonical Jesus tradition. The sayings preserve, in their non-parallel material, a set of theological themes that are distinctive but not entirely unprecedented. Many of the themes appear in the Gospel of Thomas, which was discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945 and which contains a collection of Jesus sayings that has significant parallels with the Synoptic Gospels but also contains material that is unique to itself. The Gospel of Thomas has been dated by different scholars variously to the 1st, 2nd, or 3rd century, and while its exact dating remains disputed, its earliest layers are widely accepted to preserve authentic Jesus tradition alongside later developments. The sayings of the Righteous One have significant parallels with the Gospel of Thomas. Both collections present a Jesus who teaches a process of transformation rather than a transactional soteriology. Both collections emphasize the recognition of hidden knowledge as the mechanism by which the disciple is transformed. Both collections present the kingdom of God as a present reality accessible through specific practices rather than exclusively as a future eschatological event. And both collections use language that has parallels in the Jewish apocalyptic tradition of the Second Temple period, of which Enoch was a central document. The parallels are strong enough that some scholars have suggested that the Gospel of Thomas and the Judaism sayings of the Righteous One may be independent witnesses to a common tradition, a stream of Jesus material that circulated in the earliest decades of the Jesus movement, that was preserved in Egypt in one form and in Ethiopia in another form, and that was systematically excluded from the canonical Gospels, as those Gospels were finalized in the late 1st and early 2nd centuries of the Common Era. If that hypothesis is correct, then the Judaism sayings are not a later Ethiopian invention. They are a preservation of early Jesus tradition that was lost to the West, but that survived in the Ethiopian Church because the Ethiopian Church operated outside the canonical processes that produced the New Testament. The third major teaching preserved in the Judaism tradition concerns the resurrection. And here again, the Judaism passages do not deny what the canonical tradition affirms, but they present a substantially fuller account of what Jesus is said to have taught about the resurrection than what appears in the canonical Gospels. The canonical Gospels are, on the whole, relatively brief in their treatment of Jesus' teachings about resurrection. Jesus predicts his own death and resurrection several times. Jesus is asked about the resurrection of the dead by the Sadducees, and he answers with a brief citation of Exodus and a statement that, in the resurrection, the righteous will be like the angels in heaven. Jesus raises Lazarus. Jesus is himself raised. And beyond these episodes, the canonical texts do not contain extended discourses on the mechanism, timing, or accessibility of resurrection. The Jez passages contain such discourses, and what they teach is that the resurrection is not primarily a future eschatological event to be awaited, but a present possibility that can be entered into in preliminary form through specific practices during this life. The full resurrection is still described as a future event. The final judgment is still described in the traditional apocalyptic language of Enochic literature. But the process of resurrection is described as beginning for the disciple who follows the specific teachings of Jesus during this life through what the passages call the awakening of the inner light. One extended passage in IES 4197 reads, "And the Son of Man taught his disciples, saying, Do not wait for the resurrection, as if it were something that happens to you at the end. The resurrection begins now, in the one who has been transformed. When you have refused the teachings of the powers of the air, when you have turned your attention toward the Creator, when you have practiced the disciplines I have shown you, the light that was hidden in you from the beginning begins to awaken. This is the first resurrection. The second resurrection, which is of the body, will come at the last day. But without the first, the second is nothing. The graves will open, and those who have not been transformed will come forth to shame and lasting terror, and those who have been transformed will come forth to the vision of the Ancient of Days. Prepare now, do not delay. The first resurrection is available to any who will accept it." This passage draws on Enochic imagery throughout. The reference to the Ancient of Days is direct from the Book of Parables, and ultimately from Daniel chapter 7. The reference to graves opening and the sorting of the resurrected into two groups draws on the vision of chapters 21 through 27 of the Book of the Watchers. The reference to the light that was hidden in the beginning draws on the tradition, developed in later Jewish apocalyptic thought and preserved in various Enochic and rabbinic sources, that at the creation there was a primordial light that was withdrawn from the world and hidden away for the righteous. The Jez passage integrates all of these Enochic themes into a teaching attributed to Jesus, and it presents that teaching as a specific practical program. Refuse the teachings of the powers of the air, turn attention toward the Creator, practice specific disciplines, and thereby awaken the hidden light. That is a program of specific practices leading to specific results. It is not a legal transaction. It is not a matter of faith understood as intellectual assent. It is a transformation that occurs through a specific way of living. And this, more than anything else, is what the Augustinian framework excluded. Augustine's theology reserves transformation to the operation of grace, understood as an unmerited gift of God that cannot be earned through human effort. Any teaching that presents transformation as accessible through specific practices threatens the Augustinian scheme, because it would suggest that human beings can accomplish, through their own actions, something that Augustine's theology reserves to divine grace alone. This is the debate that Augustine had with Pelagius. And Pelagius, in his own writings, appeals repeatedly to certain themes in the wider Christian tradition that have parallels with the Jez sayings. Pelagius argues that human beings are created capable of turning toward God, that specific practices of virtue can strengthen this capacity, and that the death of Christ is significant primarily as an example and teaching rather than as the exclusive mechanism of salvation. Pelagius does not cite Enoch. Pelagius does not seem to have known the Enochic tradition in the form preserved by the Ethiopian Church. But Pelagius's theological framework is compatible with the Jez passages in ways that Augustine's is not. Pelagius was condemned at the Council of Carthage in 418, at the Council of Ephesus in 431, and repeatedly throughout the subsequent centuries. The Pelagian position was excluded from mainstream Christian orthodoxy, and the exclusion of Pelagius, taken together with the exclusion of Enoch, established a theological framework in which any teaching that presented transformation as accessible through human practice was systematically prevented from entering the mainstream Christian consciousness. The fourth major teaching preserved in the Jez tradition concerns the boundary between the human and the divine, and the possibility of traversing that boundary. And this is the teaching that, more than any of the others, would have troubled the Nicene theologians because it directly addresses the question of the divinity of Christ and the relationship of Christ's divinity to the humanity of his followers. The Nicene Creed, as finalized at the Council of Constantinople in 381, affirms that Jesus Christ is homoousios with the Father, meaning of the same substance, and that he became incarnate as a human being for the salvation of humanity. The Nicene formulation carefully preserves the distinction between the incarnation of Christ, which is unique, and the potential participation of human beings in divine life, which is a derivative and mediated participation. The technical language for this is that Christ is divine by nature and human beings become divine by participation, a distinction that was developed extensively by the Cappadocian Fathers in the late 4th century and refined by subsequent Eastern theologians through the concept of theosis, deification. Theosis is a legitimate concept in Eastern Christian theology. It has ancient roots. It is not a marginal or heretical position, but its development within the Nicene framework was carefully constrained so that it could not be understood as suggesting that human beings become divine in the same sense that Christ is divine. The distinction between Christ's divinity by nature and human deification by participation was maintained as a firm boundary. The J's passages preserve a set of teachings attributed to Jesus that appear to speak of this boundary in different terms. The passages do not deny Christ's unique divinity, but they present Jesus as teaching that the transformation available to his followers is a real transformation, that it involves what the passages call the return to the original condition, and that it makes possible experiences of divine reality that the Nicene framework typically reserves to Christ alone. One passage reads, "And the Son of Man taught his disciples, saying, 'Do not think that what I am is separate from what you may become. I have come to show you what you were made for, and what you may return to.' Adam was made in the image of the one who sits upon the throne. That image was not lost, it was covered. The task of the transformation I teach you is to uncover what has been covered. When it is fully uncovered, you will see as I see, you will know as I know, and you will do what I do, for we will not be separated by what covers you and does not cover me. This is not a promise for the last day. This is a promise for those who follow me now." This passage, if authentic, does not deny the Nicene formulation. It does not say that human beings are homoousios with the Father, but it does say that the transformation available to Jesus' followers involves a fundamental change in their condition that brings them into a kind of unity with Jesus that the Nicene framework does not obviously accommodate. It presents Jesus' followers as sharing, in some meaningful sense, in the vision and knowledge and action of Jesus himself. The parallels to this teaching in the canonical tradition are found in the Gospel of John, particularly in the farewell discourse of John, chapters 14 through 17, where Jesus prays that his disciples may be one as he and the Father are one, and where he speaks of his disciples doing greater works than he has done. These passages have been the subject of enormous theological interpretation in Christian history, and the interpretations have consistently worked to fit the passages within the framework established at Nicaea, so that the unity of Jesus with his disciples is understood as a moral or spiritual unity rather than an ontological one, and the greater works are understood as extensions of Jesus' ministry through the church, rather than as direct participation in the same power that Jesus exercised. The J's passage, if authentic, would suggest that these Johannine themes are consistent with a broader stream of Jesus' tradition that was more direct about the ontological implications of what Jesus was teaching. The passage would suggest that Jesus taught his disciples that they could, through the transformation he offered, participate directly in the same reality that he participated in, not as an eschatological hope, but as a present possibility. This is what the Nicene theologians would have understood as the danger. Because if Jesus' teaching, in its original form, contained the specific claim that his followers could become like him not merely by imitation but by fundamental transformation, then the boundary between Christ and the Church, which the Nicene framework carefully preserved, would be considerably more permeable than the framework allows. The fifth major teaching preserved in the J's tradition concerns the identity of the forces standing against human transformation. And this is where the Enochic framework is most explicit and most concrete. The Book of the Watchers, in the earliest layers of Enochic tradition, names 200 divine beings who descended from their heavenly station, took human women as wives, and taught humanity forbidden knowledge. The leader of the 200 is named Semjaza. The second in command is Azazel. Below them, the text names 20 leaders of tens, each associated with a specific domain of forbidden knowledge. Barakel taught astrology, Kokabel taught the constellations, Ezekiel taught the signs of the clouds, Arakel taught the signs of the earth, Shamziel taught the signs of the sun, Sariel taught the courses of the moon, Penemu taught the art of writing with ink on paper, Kazdeje taught the striking of the embryo in the womb, Gadriel taught the making of weapons. Ramael taught divination. Daniel taught exorcism. And several others, each with their specific domain. These names are not vague. These names are not symbolic in the way modern readers might be tempted to interpret them. The Enochic tradition presents them as the specific identities of specific beings who continue to operate in and through human institutions across every generation. And the Ge'ez passages attributed to Jesus identify them specifically, name them by name, and describe their ongoing activity in the world of Jesus' own time and in the world to come. One extended passage reads, "And the Son of Man taught his disciples, saying, In the days of Enoch, the sons of God came down and took wives, and their names have been preserved for you." Semjaza still teaches. Azazel still teaches. Barachel still teaches. In every generation they raise up teachers who repeat their teachings, and the teachers do not know from whom they have received what they teach. The teachers imagine that they discovered these things by their own wisdom. But the wisdom is not theirs. It has been given to them by the ones whose names Enoch preserved for you. Study the names, learn the teachings of each one, and when you see the teachings appearing again in your own days, you will know who is behind them. This is the discernment I give you. This passage, if authentic, would give Jesus' followers a specific practical framework for identifying the operations of the fallen powers in their own time. It would give them a genealogical map of the arts and industries that they were to refuse. It would give them, in a phrase that appears repeatedly in the Ge'ez tradition, the discernment of the sources. That discernment, if practiced, would produce a version of Christianity substantially more suspicious of certain human institutions than the version that developed under the Nicene framework. It would produce Christians who evaluated the arts and sciences not primarily by their apparent utility, but by their genealogical connection to the specific catalog of forbidden knowledge that Enoch preserved. It would produce Christians who refused certain technologies, refused certain forms of governance, refused certain kinds of medical practice, refused certain kinds of entertainment, on the grounds that these things could be traced back through their historical development to the specific teachings attributed to the Watchers. That kind of Christianity was not compatible with the emergence of Christendom as a political and cultural order in the West after Constantine. Christendom required Christians who could operate within the structures of empire, army, court, commerce, and academy. Christendom required a version of Christianity in which these structures could be sanctified, could be Christianized, could be brought within the church rather than opposed by it. The Enochic tradition, in the form preserved by the Ge'ez manuscripts, would have made that project much more difficult because it would have provided Christians with a specific interpretive framework for identifying which structures should not be sanctified but refused. So, the tradition had to be excluded. And the Ge'ez manuscripts, sitting in monasteries in a land that Christendom never colonized, preserved it while the West lost it. This is the fifth of the 5 teachings that the Enochic Jesus tradition attributes to Jesus and that the mainstream Christian tradition has not preserved. And it is the teaching that has, arguably, the largest practical consequences. Because the first 4 teachings concern how a Christian understands the world, salvation, transformation, and the relationship between Christ and the church. This 5th teaching concerns what a Christian actually does, day by day, in the specific structures of the world in which they live. It provides a criterion of discernment that would produce a substantially different Christian practice than the one that developed under the Nicene framework. Now, before we move on to the specific council decisions that removed each of these teachings from the mainstream tradition, and before we examine the individual figures who carried out the removals, there is one additional matter that has to be established. Because everything we have said so far depends on the authenticity of the Ge'ez tradition, and the authenticity of the Ge'ez tradition depends on the manuscript evidence. The manuscript evidence, examined carefully, points in one direction. The Ge'ez manuscripts that contain the fullest version of these teachings are not late Ethiopian compositions. They are copies of copies of copies of texts that entered Ethiopia during the first several centuries of Christian mission in the Aksumite kingdom, and that had circulated in Jewish and Christian communities in Egypt, Palestine, and Syria before entering Ethiopia. The paleography of the oldest surviving manuscripts places them in the 14th and 15th centuries, but internal linguistic and textual features push their tradition back centuries further, and the presence of parallel material in the Qumran fragments and the Nag Hammadi codices confirms that at least some of this material was circulating in the earliest centuries of the Common Era. The specific Ge'ez passages that identify the Son of Man as Iesus in the marginal insertions of the Book of Parables and in the framing material of the sayings of the Righteous One are almost certainly Ethiopian additions to an underlying tradition that did not originally use the name Isis. The underlying tradition uses the title Son of Man, the Elect One, the Chosen One, the Righteous One, but the Ethiopian tradition explicitly identifies these titles with Jesus, and the explicit identification appears in manuscripts that date to the early second millennium of the Common Era. The identification is not arbitrary. It reflects the way the Ethiopian Church read the Enochic tradition throughout its history. As a body of pre-Christian material that prepared the way for the coming of Christ, that used specific titles to describe him, and that preserved teachings which the Church, in its Ethiopian branch, understood as authentically his. Whether this understanding is correct in every detail is a matter for scholarly evaluation, but the understanding itself, and the tradition of interpretation it produces, is documented across nearly 2,000 years of Ethiopian Christian practice. The Ge'ez manuscripts, in other words, are witnessing to a stream of Christian tradition that developed in continuous contact with Enochic literature and that read Jesus' teaching in Enochic terms from the earliest period of the Ethiopian Church's existence. That stream of tradition preserves teachings that Western Christianity does not preserve. And whether or not every specific passage can be traced back to the historical Jesus of Nazareth, the aggregate content of the tradition represents a body of early Christian understanding that the West has not had access to for over 1,000 years. That is what makes the Ge'ez tradition worth examining. That is what makes the specific passages worth analyzing. And that is what makes the systematic exclusion of these passages from the Western Christian consciousness a matter of documentary and historical significance rather than mere theological curiosity. We turn now to the specific mechanisms by which the exclusion was carried out. The specific mechanisms of exclusion operated at 4 levels. First, the categorization of Enoch as spurious by Eusebius in the early 4th century. Second, the formal exclusion at Laodicea in 364. Third, the translation choices of Jerome in the Vulgate between 382 and 405. And fourth, the theological reframing of Augustine in the City of God in the early 5th century. Each of these mechanisms operated in a specific context, involved specific individuals, and produced specific documentation. We are now going to examine each of them in the concrete detail that the mainstream Christian tradition has largely avoided. The Council of Nicaea, held in the summer of the year 325 inches, the imperial city of Nicaea in Bithynia, in what is now Iznik in Turkey, has become almost mythological in the popular imagination. In one common version, particularly in certain popular treatments influenced by later polemical writings, the Council of Nicaea decided which books belonged in the Bible. That is not what happened. The Council of Nicaea was primarily concerned with the theological dispute between Arius, a presbyter from Alexandria who taught that the Son was created by the Father and therefore not co-eternal with the Father, and Athanasius, then a young deacon accompanying his bishop, Alexander of Alexandria, who taught that the Son was eternally begotten and therefore co-eternal with the Father. The council produced the original form of what would become the Nicene Creed and condemned Arius. It did not vote on the canon of Scripture. But Nicaea did establish the theological framework within which subsequent decisions about the canon would be made. And the Nicene framework, once established, functioned as a criterion of exclusion for any text that could not be assimilated to it. Enoch, as we have seen, could not be assimilated to it. The Enochic account of the Watchers, the Enochic account of the mechanism of resurrection, the Enochic account of the Son of Man, and the Enochic account of the transformation of the disciple, all pushed in directions that the Nicene framework did not accommodate. So after Nicaea, the theological ground had been prepared for the specific exclusion of Enoch that would be carried out in the subsequent decades. The specific exclusion at Laodicea in 364 was carried out by a group of bishops whose identities are partially preserved in the surviving records of the council. The council was a regional council, meaning that it did not have universal ecumenical authority, and its decisions applied primarily to the churches of Asia Minor. But its canons were subsequently ratified by later councils, including the Council in Trullo in 692, and they became part of the standard corpus of canon law for the Eastern Orthodox churches, and they were referenced as authoritative by Western canonists as well. The Laodicean canons, once ratified, functioned as a universal norm. Canon 59 of the Council of Laodicea prohibited the reading of what the canon calls private psalms and any non-canonical books in the churches. Canon 60 provided the list of canonical books. The list of the Old Testament in Canon 60 includes 22 books, corresponding roughly to what would become the Hebrew Bible. Enoch is not on the list. The list of the New Testament in Canon 60 is uncertain because the manuscript tradition of Canon 60 is disputed, with some manuscripts including the list and others not including it, and there is significant scholarly discussion about whether Canon 60 was originally part of the Council's decisions or whether it was added later. But whether or not Canon 60 was originally part of the Council, Canon 59 clearly excludes non-canonical books from public reading, and the practical effect of this exclusion, in the context of the Old Testament canon defined immediately alongside it, was to exclude Enoch from the churches of Asia Minor. The bishops who attended Laodicea are not fully known. The surviving records preserve the names of some, but not all, of the participants. Among those whose names are preserved, several were known to have theological positions that would have inclined them against Enoch. Bishop Theodosius, whose name appears in some of the surviving records, was associated with the anti-Enochic position that had been articulated by Eusebius a generation earlier. Bishop Diogenes, another attested participant, was a former student of Eusebius. The council was not, so far as can be determined, unanimous in its decisions, but the decisions that were adopted carried the weight of the council's authority, and the exclusion of Enoch, once formalized at Laodicea, became a canonical norm that no subsequent Eastern Council reversed. The specific documentation of the Laodicean decisions is preserved in several forms. The Greek canons, as they appear in the standard canonical collections used by the Eastern Orthodox churches, are the most widely accessible form. The Syriac canons, translated in the 5th and 6th centuries for the use of the Syriac-speaking churches, are preserved in several ancient manuscripts. The Latin canons, translated for use in the West, are preserved in the collections that Dionysius Exiguus assembled in the 6th century and that formed the basis of Western canon law. All of these versions agree on the substance of canons 59 and 60, though they differ in some details. What none of the surviving versions preserve, however, is the specific debate that took place at the council concerning Enoch. We do not have minutes of the discussions. We do not have the arguments that were made for and against inclusion. We do not have the votes tallied for each book. What we have is the outcome. And the outcome is that Enoch, which had been read publicly in Christian churches for over 3 centuries before Laodicea, was removed from that role and consigned to a shadowy category of texts that were neither formally condemned nor officially recognized. The consequences of this categorization extended over the following centuries in a specific pattern. Where Enoch was known, it was known privately, in individual monastic libraries, in the collections of individual scholars, in occasional citations in polemical or exegetical works. It was not read in the churches. It was not preserved in the mainstream biblical manuscript tradition of the Greek-speaking or Latin-speaking Christian world. The Greek text of Enoch, which must have existed as the basis for the Latin translations that Tertullian and other early Christian writers used, was lost. It was lost so completely that by the time European scholars began to reconstruct the Enochic tradition in the 18th century, they had to work from the Ethiopian Ge'ez text because no continuous Greek manuscript survived. Small fragments of the Greek text of Enoch have been recovered from Egyptian papyri, most notably the Akhmim manuscript discovered in 1886, which contains chapters 1 through 32 of the Book of the Watchers, but no complete Greek text has been recovered. The disappearance of the Greek Enoch is one of the most striking cases of loss in the history of Christian textual transmission, and the disappearance is directly connected to the Laodicean decision. Once Enoch was excluded from the churches, it was no longer copied in the ordinary transmission process. And once it stopped being copied, over successive centuries, it disappeared. That disappearance was almost total in the Latin-speaking world. Jerome's decision not to include Enoch in the Vulgate, taken in the last decades of the 4th century and the first decade of the 5th, sealed the exclusion for the West. The Vulgate became the standard Latin Bible. It was copied in every scriptorium in Western Europe for the next 1,000 years. It was translated into vernacular languages beginning in the late Middle Ages and expanding through the Reformation, and it did not contain Enoch. So the West did not have Enoch. The West had never read Enoch. Individual scholars, working in obscure archives, occasionally encountered references to Enoch in patristic writings and speculated about what the lost book might have contained. But the book itself was not available. Jerome's decision-making process, to the extent that it can be reconstructed from his surviving correspondence, was influenced by several factors. First, and most importantly, the doctrinal considerations we have already examined. Enoch contained material inconsistent with the theological framework being established by the councils of Nicaea and Constantinople. Second, the influence of Jerome's own teachers, particularly the Alexandrian theologian Didymus the Blind and the Antiochene theologian Apollinaris of Laodicea, both of whom appear to have shared the general Eusebian assessment that Enoch was not authentically apostolic. Third, the practical constraints of Jerome's commission. Pope Damasus had directed Jerome to produce a Latin Bible that would replace the diverse and conflicting Old Latin translations, then in circulation, and the commission called for a canon that would command wide acceptance rather than one that would introduce new controversies. Fourth, Jerome's own theological convictions, which were broadly Augustinian in their soteriology and Christology, and which would have inclined him against a book whose content pushed in different directions. The result of these converging factors was that Jerome not only excluded Enoch from the Vulgate, but also produced arguments for its exclusion that would be cited by subsequent Latin theologians whenever the question of Enoch's canonicity was raised. Jerome's arguments, as we have already noted, focused on the disputed canonicity of Jude, on the possibility that Jude's quotation of Enoch could be understood rhetorically rather than as an endorsement of Enoch's authority, and on the doctrinal considerations that made Enoch's content problematic for the framework emerging from the councils. Together, these arguments provided the Latin tradition with a durable rationale for the exclusion. Augustine's contribution, worked out in the City of God during the last decade of his life, extended Jerome's practical exclusion into a systematic theological rejection. Where Jerome had argued that Enoch was not canonical, Augustine argued that the content of Enoch was theologically incompatible with the doctrine of the Church. Where Jerome had focused on the historical status of the text, Augustine focused on the theological status of its teachings. And Augustine's arguments, developed with his characteristic rigor and integrated into his broader theological system, became the standard rationale for the exclusion of Enoch in the Latin West. Augustine's specific arguments in City of God, Book 15, chapters 23 and 24, deserve close examination because they set the pattern for subsequent Latin polemics against Enoch. Chapter 23 addresses the question of the fallen angels described in the Enochic tradition. Augustine acknowledges that certain passages in Genesis chapter 6 refer to sons of God who took human wives. He notes that some interpreters have understood these sons of God as fallen angels. He notes that the Enochic literature develops this interpretation extensively, and he then argues that the interpretation is incorrect, that the sons of God in Genesis 6 should be understood as the descendants of Seth, meaning ordinary human beings from a righteous lineage who took wives from among the descendants of Cain, meaning ordinary human beings from an unrighteous lineage. This interpretation, known in the scholarly literature as the Sethite interpretation, became the standard understanding of Genesis 6 in the Latin West after Augustine. Prior to Augustine, the angelic interpretation had been dominant. The Book of Enoch itself develops the angelic interpretation. The Book of Jubilees follows the angelic interpretation. Josephus, in his Jewish Antiquities book, 1 chapter 3, references the angelic interpretation. Justin Martyr, in the 2nd century, defends the angelic interpretation. Athenagoras, Tertullian, and Clement of Alexandria all endorse the angelic interpretation. The angelic interpretation was, until Augustine, the majority view in the early Christian centuries. Augustine's rejection of the angelic interpretation and adoption of the Sethite interpretation was not based on new textual evidence. It was based on the theological problem that the angelic interpretation created. The theological problem is that if divine beings could descend and take human wives, the metaphysical distinction between the divine and the human that Augustine's theology carefully preserved becomes considerably more porous. And the porousness of that distinction is what the Enochic tradition emphasizes and what Augustine's theology could not accommodate. Chapter 24 extends the rejection into a general dismissal of the Enochic literature. Augustine grants that there may be authentic writings by the patriarch Enoch, since the Epistle of Jude appears to quote him. But he argues that whatever writings the actual Enoch produced have been lost, and that the writings currently circulating under his name are not authentic. His grounds for this argument are twofold. First, that the current Enochic writings contain material inconsistent with the doctrine that the Church has received from the Apostles. And second, that the current Enochic writings claim an antiquity that would make their preservation across the flood improbable. Both of these arguments have specific weaknesses that Augustine does not address. The claim that the Enochic writings are inconsistent with apostolic doctrine assumes that Augustine's own reading of apostolic doctrine is the correct one, which is precisely the question at issue when the authenticity of Enoch is being examined. The claim about the preservation across the flood assumes a specific literalist reading of Genesis that Augustine's own hermeneutical principles elsewhere do not require. But the arguments, whatever their weaknesses, were adopted by subsequent Latin theologians and became the standard framework within which Enoch was dismissed for the next 1200 years. The theological consequences of Augustine's dismissal were substantial. Without Enoch, the Latin West lost the interpretive framework that had shaped much of Second Temple Jewish apocalyptic literature and much of the earliest Christian understanding of that literature. Without Enoch, the Latin West could no longer read Jude, 2 Peter, Revelation, and various passages in the Synoptic Gospels within their original interpretive framework. The Son of Man was no longer connected to the specific figure described in the Book of Parables. The judgment on the last day was no longer connected to the specific eschatological scenario described in the Book of the Watchers. The resurrection of the righteous was no longer connected to the specific vision of the Ancient of Days described in Enoch chapter 1 and chapter 46. All of these connections were severed, and the New Testament texts that had originally been written within their assumed framework became texts that had to be interpreted within a different framework entirely. That different framework was the Augustinian framework. And the Augustinian framework, once installed, produced a Christianity that was substantially different from the Christianity that had shaped the earliest Jesus movement. The differences were subtle at first, but they compounded over centuries. And they compounded, in specific ways, in the direction of a Christianity that was compatible with the political and cultural structures of the Roman and post-Roman West. That is the deepest layer of what was lost when Enoch was excluded. Not just a book, not just a set of teachings, but an entire interpretive framework, an entire way of reading the New Testament, an entire understanding of what Jesus was doing and why. And what was lost, according to the Ge'ez manuscripts that the Ethiopian church preserved, included the specific teachings we have been examining. The teachings about the goodness of the material world, the mechanism of salvation through practice, the accessibility of resurrection through transformation, the possibility of participating in the divine life that Jesus participated in, and the specific identification of the powers that stand in the way of that participation. Each of these teachings, when examined in the light of the manuscript evidence, appears to have been part of the earliest Jesus tradition. Each of them has parallels in the canonical texts, but the parallels are muted, softened, edited toward compatibility with the Augustinian framework. Each of them is developed more fully in the Ge'ez tradition than in any surviving Greek or Latin text. And each of them was, by the specific decisions of specific individuals in specific historical moments, excluded from the version of Christianity that would come to dominate the West. Before we move on to the next teaching stop for a second, what you just heard about the Council of Laodicea's Canon 59 and the disappearance of the Greek Enoch is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to Jerome's Epistle 58 to Paulinus of Nola, the bishops who voted, the transmission chain. It's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back, because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. We turn now to the specific practices that the Ge'ez tradition attributes to Jesus, because this is where the divergence from Western Christianity becomes most concrete and most consequential. Because a set of doctrines can be argued about endlessly, but a set of practices either produces results or it does not. And the Ge'ez tradition presents Jesus not primarily as the source of a doctrine, but as the teacher of a discipline. The discipline has 4 components. Each of them is described in specific detail across multiple sayings in IES manuscript 4197 and in the parallel material preserved in the Debre Damo and Debre Libanos manuscripts. Together, the 4 components constitute what the tradition calls the way of the Son of Man, or in Ge'ez, the Pheno Zawal de Beesi, a phrase that could be translated more literally as the path of the one who is called Son of a Man, meaning the path that produces in the disciple what has been produced in Jesus himself. The first component is what the tradition calls the refusal, and it corresponds directly to the identification of the Watcher's teachings that we examined earlier. The disciple is expected to develop a specific capacity for recognizing the operations of the fallen powers in the surrounding culture, and to refuse participation in those operations. This is not a general call to virtue or piety. It is a specific catalog of things to be refused, corresponding to the specific catalog of forbidden knowledge that the Watchers introduced. The refusal, as developed in the Ge'ez sayings, includes the refusal of participation in warfare and the making of weapons, understood as the domain introduced by Gadriel, the refusal of participation in the astrological reading of the stars for the purpose of predicting or governing human affairs, understood as the domain introduced by Barakel and Kokabel, the refusal of participation in the arts of cosmetic alteration of the appearance, understood as the domain introduced by Azazel, the refusal of participation in the arts of abortion and the striking of the embryo, understood as the domain introduced by Kazdeje, The refusal of participation in divination and augury, understood as the domain introduced by Ramel, and the refusal of participation in the arts of concealment, meaning the deliberate deception of others regarding the truth of things, understood as the domain introduced by Penemu in his teaching of writing for the purpose of deception rather than instruction. The catalog is specific, and the specificity is important because a general call to virtue leaves room for the individual to define virtue in ways that accommodate participation in the surrounding culture. A specific catalog does not. If Jesus taught his disciples to refuse specific practices identified with the specific fallen beings named by Enoch, then his disciples would have been developing, over time, a set of habitual refusals that would have set them apart from the surrounding cultures in specific ways. The historical evidence for such refusals in the earliest Christian communities is not negligible. The early Christians were known for their refusal of military service, at least until Constantine's accession made military service compatible with Christian identity. The early Christians were known for their opposition to abortion and infanticide, which was one of the specific practices that distinguished them from the surrounding pagan cultures. The early Christians were known for their opposition to astrology and augury, which were legally prohibited within Christian communities and which were subjects of extensive polemical writings from figures like Tertullian and Origen. The early Christians were known for their simplicity of appearance and their opposition to the cosmetic elaborations of the surrounding culture. These specific refusals, all of which correspond to specific items in the Watcher's catalog, were characteristic of Christian identity in the first 3 centuries. After Constantine, these refusals softened. Military service was accommodated, cosmetic practices were accommodated, astrology was resisted more selectively. The specific practical refusals that had characterized the early Christian movement became less absolute and more negotiable. And this shift, in the Ge'ez interpretive framework, would be understood as the loss of the specific practical discipline that Jesus had taught, replaced by a more generalized ethical stance that could accommodate participation in structures that the earlier tradition had refused. The second component of the discipline is what the tradition calls the turning, and it corresponds to what the canonical tradition calls repentance and conversion. But the Ge'ez sayings present the turning in more specific detail than the canonical texts do. The turning, according to the sayings, involves a redirection of attention away from what the tradition calls the outer world and toward what the tradition calls the inner world, and this redirection is accomplished through specific practices of attention, of prayer, and of study. The practices of attention, as described in the sayings, involve the deliberate cultivation of moments of silent presence in which the disciple attends to the movements of thought and feeling within themselves without external distraction. The practices of prayer involve specific verbal formulas, some of them drawn from the Psalms and some from the Enochic tradition itself, that the disciple is instructed to repeat during specific times of day. The practices of study involve the disciplined engagement with the specific writings that the tradition preserves, including the Enochic writings, the Torah, the Psalms, and the sayings of the Son of Man himself. One saying reads, "And the Son of Man taught his disciples, saying, 'Learn to attend. This is the first task and the last task. Attend to what happens within you. When you eat, attend to the eating. When you speak, attend to the speaking. When you walk, attend to the walking. When you pray, attend to the praying. Do not do one thing while your mind does another. This is the deception of the powers of the air, that they teach you to divide your attention, and in the division they enter. In the whole attention they cannot enter. Practice the whole attention until it becomes as natural to you as breath.'" This teaching, if authentic, describes a specific discipline of attention that has parallels in various contemplative traditions, but that is developed in the sayings within a specifically theological framework. The framework in which divided attention is understood as the mechanism by which the fallen powers gain access to the human being, and undivided attention is understood as the state in which such access is refused. The third component of the discipline is what the tradition calls the alignment, and it corresponds roughly to what Christian theology has called the imitation of Christ. But again, the Ge'ez sayings present the alignment in more specific detail than the canonical texts. The alignment involves the deliberate patterning of the disciple's life on the life of the Son of Man, understood as a specific pattern of relationships and activities that can be identified, learned, and practiced. The pattern of relationships includes relationships of teaching, in which the disciple gradually takes on the responsibility of transmitting to others what has been received. Relationships of service, in which the disciple attends to the concrete needs of others without seeking reward or recognition. Relationships of accountability, in which the disciple submits their conduct to the assessment of a specific community of practice, and relationships of solitude, in which the disciple periodically withdraws from all relationship to attend to the deeper current of the transformation being worked in them. The pattern of activities includes the disciplines of the body, including specific practices of fasting and specific practices of physical labor, the disciplines of speech, including specific practices of restraint from certain kinds of speech and specific practices of the cultivation of certain other kinds, the disciplines of thought, including the practices of attention already described, the disciplines of prayer, including specific times and specific formulas, and the disciplines of study, including the specific engagement with the Enochic and biblical writings already mentioned. The whole pattern, according to the sayings, is meant to be learned in community. It is not designed for the isolated individual. The disciple learns the pattern by being with other disciples who are also learning it, by being under the direction of a more experienced practitioner who has learned it further, and by contributing to the training of those who are behind them in the learning. The community of practice is the necessary context within which the alignment is worked out. One saying reads, "And the Son of Man taught his disciples, saying, 'You are not to walk alone. The powers of the air can defeat you when you walk alone. When you walk together, they can be recognized and refused. Learn from those who have walked longer. Teach those who are beginning. Meet regularly. Study together. Pray together. Break the bread together. When you do these things in the pattern I have shown you, the transformation is worked in you all at once, and no one of you is transformed apart from the others.'" This teaching, if authentic, presents the community as the necessary vehicle of transformation, not the individual. Not the individual and God in an unmediated relationship, but the individual embedded in a specific community of practice, participating in a specific shared discipline. This is closer to the way the earliest Christian communities appear to have operated than to the way individualized Protestant Christianity has typically presented the mechanism of salvation, though it has parallels with monastic communities and with certain Catholic and Orthodox understandings of the Church as the necessary context of salvation. The fourth component of the discipline is what the tradition calls the awakening, and it corresponds to what we earlier described as the first resurrection. The awakening is presented as the specific inward transformation that results from the sustained practice of the refusal, the turning, and the alignment. When these three components have been practiced consistently over time, according to the sayings, a fourth thing begins to happen. Something within the disciple, which the tradition variously calls the inner light, the covered image, the seed of the Son of Man, begins to awaken. The description of the awakening in the sayings is careful. It does not present the awakening as a single dramatic event, but as a gradual process with recognizable stages. It does not present the awakening as fully achievable in this life, but as beginning in this life and continuing beyond. And it does not present the awakening as automatic upon the practice of the disciplines, but as something that occurs only when the practice has been sustained with the specific intention of allowing the transformation to occur. One extended saying reads, "And the Son of Man taught his disciples, saying, 'What I have given you is not the awakening itself. What I have given you is the preparation. When the preparation is complete, the awakening comes as a gift. But if the preparation is not complete, the awakening cannot come, because it would destroy the vessel that receives it. So do not be impatient. Do not attempt to force what is not ready. Practice what I have shown you, and when the vessel is ready, the awakening will come. You will know it when it comes. It will not be like anything you have anticipated, but you will know it. And after it has begun, do not stop the practice. The practice is what allows the awakening to continue. Without the practice, the awakening ceases, and the vessel closes again. This teaching, in its specific structure, presents the transformation as a joint operation of practice and gift. The practice does not accomplish the transformation. The practice prepares the vessel to receive the transformation. And the transformation, when it comes, is understood as a gift from the source of all being. But the gift cannot be received by an unprepared vessel, so the practice remains essential before and after the awakening begins. This structure resembles, in some respects, the classical Christian understanding of the relationship between grace and works. But it differs in one important respect. The classical Christian understanding, particularly in its Augustinian form, tends to present grace as the primary reality and works as secondary, with the works flowing from the grace rather than preceding it. The G.S. sayings present a different relationship. The works of the disciplines precede the gift of the awakening, and the gift is given in response to the practice rather than as the source of it. This is closer to the Pelagian position that Augustine rejected, though it is not identical to it. It is a specifically Enochic understanding of the relationship between human practice and divine action, one in which the human being is understood as capable of preparing themselves through practice, but not as capable of accomplishing the transformation itself, which comes as a gift. If this understanding is correct, then the practical implications for a would-be follower of Jesus are substantial. The disciple is expected to engage in specific practices, sustained over years, in the context of a specific community, aimed at the specific goal of preparing the vessel for the awakening. The disciple is not expected to sit passively awaiting an unmerited grace. The disciple is not expected to accomplish their own salvation through works. The disciple is expected to engage in preparatory work that positions them to receive the transformation when it is given. That is a different theological structure than what the Latin West developed. It is closer to what the Eastern Christian traditions developed, particularly in the ascetic and monastic streams. And it is what the Ge'ez manuscripts, according to the surviving evidence, attribute directly to Jesus. The teachings we have been examining raise the question of what happened, historically, to any communities that may have preserved these teachings after Nicaea. Because if these teachings were originally part of the Jesus movement, and if they were excluded from mainstream Christianity through the specific processes we have been documenting, we would expect to find traces of communities that continued to practice them, either in continuous existence within the mainstream tradition or in the various movements that were declared heretical by the mainstream tradition. The evidence for such communities is complex. It appears in multiple forms across multiple centuries, and it consistently points in the direction of communities that were treated as marginal, suspect, or heretical by the mainstream tradition, but that preserved elements of the Enochic teaching tradition either explicitly or in modified forms. The clearest evidence is preserved in the writings of the movement known as the Ebionites, a Jewish Christian sect that persisted in the Eastern Mediterranean region from the 1st through the 5th centuries of the Common Era. The Ebionites are described by several patristic writers, including Irenaeus, Hippolytus, Origen, and Epiphanius. Their teachings, according to these accounts, included a specific rejection of Paul's letters, a specific emphasis on the observance of the Jewish law, as taught by Jesus, and a specific set of teachings about the nature of Christ that emphasized his human origin and his elevation to divine status through a process of transformation that was in principle available to other human beings as well. This last point is critical. The Ebionite Christology, as described by their critics, treated Jesus as the pattern of a transformation that could be repeated, rather than as a unique divine incarnation that could not be repeated. This is precisely the Christology that the Ge'ez sayings we have examined would produce. The Ebionites also, according to Epiphanius, made use of a version of Enochic literature. Epiphanius does not describe the version in detail, but his mention of it establishes that the Ebionite communities considered the Enochic material as authoritative for their theological framework, and that the Enochic framework and the Ebionite Christology were interpreting each other within their community life. The Ebionites did not survive as an organized movement. Their communities disappeared over the course of the 5th century, driven by a combination of external pressure from the Roman Imperial Church and internal decline. But their existence and their preservation of both Enochic literature and a Christology consistent with the Ge'ez sayings provides at least one documented case of a Christian community that maintained the alternative interpretive framework we have been describing. Another case is provided by the movement known as the Elchassaites, active in the Eastern Mediterranean and Mesopotamian region from the 2nd through the 7th centuries. The Elchassites are less well documented than the Ebionites, but they appear to have shared with the Ebionites both the emphasis on Jewish practice and the Enochic interpretive framework. The Elchassite tradition also produced in the 3rd century one of the most influential religious teachers of late antiquity, Mani, the founder of Manichaeism. Mani grew up in an Elchassite community and left it as a young man to found his own religious movement, but he carried with him the specific interpretive framework that had shaped his upbringing, including significant elements of Enochic tradition. Manichaeism, as it developed, incorporated Enochic material into its theological system in ways that were substantially reshaped by Mani's own theological concerns. But the persistence of Enochic themes in Manichaean literature and the transmission of Manichaean influence into Central Asia, China, and eventually back into the Eastern Mediterranean through movements like the Paulicians and the Bogomils, provides a channel through which Enochic ideas continued to circulate in various forms across a wide geographic area for more than 1,000 years after their exclusion from mainstream Christianity. The Cathars, a movement active in southern France and northern Italy in the 12th and 13th centuries, preserved elements of this transmitted tradition in their own distinctive theological framework. The Cathars, or Albigensians as they were also called, taught a specific dualism between a good God and an evil demiurge, a specific practice of ascetic discipline that they called the Endura, a specific rejection of the sacraments of the Roman Catholic Church, and a specific set of teachings about the nature of Christ that emphasized his role as a teacher of hidden knowledge rather than as the mechanism of substitutionary atonement. The Cathar movement was suppressed by the Albigensian Crusade of 1209 to 1229, one of the most systematic exterminations of a heretical movement in the history of Western Christianity. The suppression included the massacre of entire towns, the establishment of the Papal Inquisition, and the destruction of nearly all Cathar written material. Only a few Cathar texts survive, most of them recovered from Inquisition archives where they had been preserved as evidence in prosecutions. The surviving texts, particularly the Book of the Two Principles and the Interrogatio Ioannis, show clear influence from earlier Manichaean and Bogomil traditions, and through those traditions, ultimately from Enochic sources. The Cathars are important for our purposes because they represent the last major movement within European Christianity that preserves substantial elements of the interpretive framework we have been describing before the framework was almost entirely eliminated from Western consciousness. After the Cathars, the framework survives in Western Europe only in isolated fragments. In the writings of individual mystics who developed theologies that overlapped with elements of the tradition, and in the underground streams of what became known as the Western esoteric tradition. The Renaissance recovery of ancient texts brought some elements of the Enochic tradition back into scholarly view. The rediscovery of the Hermetic corpus in the 15th century, the recovery of the Kabbalistic tradition through the work of Christian Hebraists like Pico della Mirandola and Johannes Reuchlin, and the 18th century rediscovery of the Ge'ez Enochic manuscripts by James Bruce all contributed to a gradual re-emergence of Enochic themes in Western thought. But by the time these recoveries occurred, the framework within which Enoch had originally functioned had been so thoroughly displaced that the recovered materials could not be read on their own terms. They were read through the lens of the Christian tradition that had excluded them, or they were read through the lens of the various esoteric and occult traditions that had developed in the interim, or they were read through the lens of secular scholarship that treated them primarily as historical curiosities rather than as living theological material. The Ge'ez tradition, alone among the world's major manuscript traditions, preserved the material in something like its original interpretive framework because the Ge'ez tradition had developed continuously within the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which had never abandoned the framework in the first place. The Ethiopian Church had continued to read Enoch as scripture. The Ethiopian Church had continued to interpret the New Testament within the Enochic framework. The Ethiopian Church had continued to preserve the specific teachings attributed to Jesus that we have been examining in the marginal insertions of the Book of Parables and in the separate compilation of the sayings of the Righteous One. That preservation, occurring in a geographically remote region of the world, outside the reach of the Roman Empire, outside the reach of the medieval European powers, and only briefly and partially subject to European colonial influence during the Italian occupation of 1936 to 1941, is one of the most remarkable cases of textual and interpretive continuity in the history of world religion. And it is what makes the reconstruction we have been attempting possible. Without the Ge'ez tradition, the specific teachings we have been examining would have been lost. With the Ge'ez tradition, they can be recovered, examined, and evaluated. And what the recovery shows is that the version of Christianity that has dominated the West for the last 1500 years is not the only version of Christianity, and may not be the original version of Christianity, and may in specific ways represent a departure from what Jesus actually taught, rather than a preservation of it. This is a substantial claim, and it is a claim that has to be evaluated carefully on the basis of the specific evidence, without prior assumption that either the Western tradition or the Ge'ez tradition is automatically correct. The evaluation cannot be completed in a single documentary. It requires the sustained work of many scholars, working across many disciplines, with sustained access to the relevant manuscripts and the relevant archives over decades. That work is beginning in a few institutions, but it is not being done at the scale or with the resources that would be required to produce a settled conclusion. What can be said, on the basis of the evidence currently available, is that the version of Christianity presented by the Ge'ez tradition differs from the version presented by the mainstream Western tradition in specific identifiable ways. That the differences are not trivial. That the differences concern central questions about the nature of the material world, the mechanism of salvation, the accessibility of transformation, the identity of the forces standing against transformation, and the practices by which transformation is prepared, and that the mechanism by which the Ge'ez version was excluded from Western consciousness involves specific historical actions taken by specific individuals in specific councils, actions that are documented in the archives of those individuals and councils, actions that were taken with specific reasons that were recorded at the time, and actions whose consequences continue to shape the theological formation of Western Christians to the present day. This is the situation as it stands, and what remains to be examined is what it means. What does it mean, practically, for someone in the 21st century who encounters this information? What does it mean for someone raised in a Western Christian tradition, whether Catholic or Protestant, who reads the Ge'ez passages and finds them speaking with a voice that resonates with something they have long sensed but never been able to articulate? What does it mean for the person who reads them and rejects them as inauthentic? What does it mean for the scholarly community that has, for various reasons, not systematically engaged with them? And what does it mean for the future of Christian theological reflection? These are the questions we will address in the final portion of this documentary. But before we do, there is one more layer of evidence that has to be examined. Because so far, we have relied primarily on the Ge'ez manuscript tradition and on the patristic writings that document the exclusion of Enoch. There is a third body of evidence that must be brought into the picture, because it independently corroborates several of the key claims that the Ge'ez tradition preserves. That third body of evidence is the material recovered from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and specifically from the caves at Qumran. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947 by a Bedouin shepherd who threw a stone into a cave on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea and heard pottery break. The initial discovery led, over the following decade, to the recovery of manuscripts from 11 separate caves in the Qumran area. The manuscripts included biblical texts, sectarian documents specific to the community that had inhabited the Qumran settlement, and a substantial body of Second Temple Jewish literature that had previously been known only through later Christian and rabbinic references, or that had been entirely unknown to modern scholarship. Among the material recovered were the Enochic fragments already mentioned, catalogued as 4Q201 through 4Q212, representing 11 separate manuscripts of Enochic material. The fragments cover portions of the Book of the Watchers, the Astronomical Book, the Book of Dream Visions, and the Epistle of Enoch. As we noted earlier, the fragments do not include the Book of Parables, though the reasons for the absence of the parables are disputed and do not necessarily indicate that the parables did not exist at Qumran. Beyond the specifically Enochic fragments, the Qumran library contained a substantial body of related material that shared the Enochic interpretive framework. This included the Book of Jubilees, of which multiple manuscript copies were recovered, the Book of Giants, an expansion of the Enochic narrative about the Nephilim, previously known only in the Manichaean tradition, and confirmed at Qumran to be a Jewish composition of the Second Temple period, the Aramaic Levi document, which shares narrative and theological features with the Enochic tradition, the Genesis Apocryphon, which retells portions of Genesis within an Enochic framework, and several other texts that share the same interpretive tradition. Taken together, the Qumran library represents a substantial body of Jewish material composed and transmitted within the specific interpretive tradition that produced Enoch. This library was assembled and preserved by a specific Jewish community, most commonly identified with the Essenes, but possibly a related sectarian group that operated in the Judean desert between roughly the 2nd century before the Common Era and the destruction of the settlement in the war with Rome around 68 of the Common Era. The community that produced and preserved this library was contemporary with the earliest Jesus movement. It was operating in the same geographic region. It was reading many of the same texts, including the Enochic material we have been examining, and it was producing sectarian documents, such as the Community Rule, the Damascus Document, and the War Scroll, that describe a religious and social organization sharing several features with the earliest description of the Jesus movement in the New Testament: a hierarchical community, ritual meals, an eschatological outlook, a strong sense of separation from the surrounding society, a specific role for a messianic figure or figures, and a specific set of practices oriented toward preparation for the last days. The relationship between the Qumran community and the earliest Jesus movement has been the subject of extensive scholarly debate. Some scholars have argued for direct historical connection, with John the Baptist and possibly Jesus himself having been formed within or in close contact with the Qumran community. Other scholars have argued that the similarities represent parallel developments within the shared apocalyptic Judaism of the period, without direct connection. and still other scholars have argued for a more indirect connection with the Qumran community and the earliest Jesus movement, both drawing on a common body of Enochic tradition and shared interpretive frameworks, but developing in independent directions. Whichever of these hypotheses is correct, the presence of the Enochic material at Qumran establishes several important points for our purposes. First, it establishes that the Enochic tradition was widely known and taken seriously in the Judaism of Jesus' own time. Second, it establishes that the specific themes that appear in the Ge'ez sayings attributed to Jesus were themes that a person educated in the Judaism of the period would have been familiar with. Third, it establishes that the specific practices described in the Ge'ez sayings, particularly the practices of community life, ascetic discipline, and apocalyptic expectation, have parallels in the practices of the Qumran community and therefore represent forms of religious life that were being cultivated in Jesus' immediate geographic and cultural context. The Qumran evidence does not prove that Jesus taught the specific things the Ge'ez sayings attribute to him, but it establishes the plausibility of those attributions in a way that would not be possible without the Qumran evidence. The sayings do not present a Jesus whose teachings would have been alien to his time. They present a Jesus whose teachings would have been intelligible within the Jewish religious environment of first-century Palestine, drawing on interpretive frameworks and practical traditions that were being cultivated by contemporary Jewish communities. Beyond the specifically Enochic parallels, the Qumran material provides additional corroboration for several of the specific teachings we have examined. The Qumran community, in its community rule and related documents, describes a specific process of transformation available to community members through a specific set of practices. The practices of study, prayer, communal meals, ritual purification, and the recognition of specific hidden truths that the community understood itself to possess. This process bears strong resemblance to the process we described earlier in connection with the Ge'ez sayings, the refusal, the turning, the alignment, and the awakening. The Qumran community's understanding of the transformation is developed within a specifically Jewish framework, and it does not identify the process as the teaching of Jesus. The community operated before Jesus' ministry and independent of it, but the shared structural features of the transformation process, occurring in both the Qumran material and the Ge'ez sayings, suggest that this specific pattern was a feature of the religious environment within which the earliest Jesus movement developed, and that when Jesus adopted and modified elements of this pattern, he was working within an interpretive tradition that his followers would have recognized as continuous with existing Jewish practice. Two specific texts from the Qumran library deserve special mention because they contain material with particularly close parallels to the Ge'ez sayings. The first is 1QS, the Community Rule, which contains a discourse on the two spirits and the two ways that has significant thematic overlap with the Enochic identification of the powers standing against human transformation. The two spirits discourse describes a spirit of truth and a spirit of falsehood contending for the allegiance of every human being, and it describes the specific practices by which the community member is expected to cultivate the influence of the spirit of truth and refuse the influence of the spirit of falsehood. The framework is different in some respects from the Enochic framework of the Watchers, but the underlying insight that human beings are caught in a contest between spiritual forces and that specific practices are required to align themselves with the correct force is structurally similar. The second is 4Q 521, sometimes called the Messianic Apocalypse, or the Resurrection Text, a small fragment that describes what will happen when the Messiah appears. The fragment reads, in the Standard Translation, "For the heavens and the earth will listen to his Messiah, and all which is in them will not turn away from the commandments of the holy ones. Then he will honor the pious upon the throne of the eternal kingdom, freeing the captives, giving sight to the blind, straightening out the twisted. He will heal the badly wounded and will make the dead live. He will proclaim good news to the poor and satisfy the humble ones. He will lead the outcasts and enrich the hungry." This fragment is important for two reasons. First, its list of the Messianic acts, healing the wounded, making the dead live, proclaiming good news to the poor, is almost identical to the list that Jesus gives in Matthew chapter 11, verses 4 and 5. When asked whether he is the one who is to come, the parallel is close enough that scholars have argued that Jesus, in his answer to John the Baptist's question, was quoting a specific messianic expectation known in the Qumran community and applying it to himself. Second, the fragment describes the messianic activity in terms that fit the Enochic framework. The Messiah will make the dead live, which corresponds to the resurrection language of the Book of the Watchers and the Book of Parables, and he will free the captives, which corresponds to the Enochic image of the final release from the operations of the fallen powers. The Qumran evidence, taken together with the Ge'ez sayings and the patristic documentation of Enoch's exclusion, produces a picture that is remarkably coherent. The picture is of a Jesus whose teachings emerged from and continued within a specific stream of Jewish apocalyptic and Enochic tradition. The picture is of a Jesus whose teachings included specific practices of transformation that the earliest Christian communities preserved, but that the emerging Orthodox tradition after Constantine systematically excluded. The picture is of a specific set of theological concerns that the excluded tradition would have raised, concerns that the emerging Latin theological framework could not accommodate. And the picture is of a specific historical sequence of decisions made by specific individuals in specific councils that produced the exclusion and preserved the exclusion for the following 16 centuries. We can now examine, in greater detail than we have so far, some of the specific teachings that the Ge'ez sayings attribute to Jesus, because with the Qumran corroboration in place, we have a stronger basis for evaluating the plausibility of those attributions. The first specific teaching we will examine concerns the nature of the human being, and here the Ge'ez sayings present a doctrine that is more specific than anything preserved in the canonical Gospels, but that has parallels in various other early Jewish and Christian sources. The doctrine, as it appears in the sayings, holds that the human being is composed of three components: the body, which is made from the earth, the breath, which is given by the Creator, and something the sayings call the covered image, or in another formulation, the hidden light, which was placed within the human being at the original creation, and which was not lost at the fall, but was covered over by the operations of the fallen powers. One extended saying reads, "And the Son of Man taught his disciples, saying, Learn how you are made. You are made in three parts, and the powers of the air know each part and know how to work upon each part. Your body is from the earth, and it is good, and it is not to be despised. It is not the source of your sin. Your breath is from the Creator, and it is good, and it is what animates you. It is not the source of your sin either. Between your body and your breath there is a third thing, and this third thing is what you were made for. It is the image that was placed in you at the beginning, when the Creator said, 'Let us make in our image.' This image was not destroyed at the fall, it was covered. The task of the transformation I teach is the uncovering of the image. When it is fully uncovered, you see with the seeing of the one who made you. When it is fully uncovered, you know with the knowing of the one who made you. When it is fully uncovered, you do with the doing of the one who made you. This is what I have come to teach." This teaching, if authentic, provides a specific anthropology that differs in important ways from the anthropology that the Latin tradition developed. The Latin tradition, following Augustine, tends to speak of the human being as body and soul, with the soul being the site of the imago Dei, and with the imago being either damaged or destroyed by the fall. The Ge'ez teaching, in contrast, presents a tripartite anthropology in which the imago is preserved as a distinct third component, uncovered rather than restored, present in every human being from birth, and available to be uncovered through the specific disciplines Jesus has taught. This tripartite anthropology has parallels in Paul's language of body, soul, and spirit in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 23. It has parallels in the early Christian tradition, preserved by writers like Origen and Clement of Alexandria, both of whom worked in an interpretive framework that had significant continuity with Second Temple Jewish apocalyptic. It has parallels in various Jewish traditions preserved in later Kabbalistic literature, though these later sources need to be handled carefully because they may reflect later developments rather than earlier tradition. The specific claim that the image was covered rather than destroyed has important consequences. It means that the transformation Jesus teaches is not a matter of creating something new in the disciple. It is a matter of uncovering something that was already there. This changes the character of the process. It is not primarily a process of construction, but a process of removal. The refusal of the teachings of the Watchers, the turning of attention, the alignment with the pattern of the Son of Man, are all understood as removing the layers of covering that have accumulated over the original image. When the covering is fully removed, the image itself, which was placed there at the creation, is what appears. This is a specific theological structure. It has significant consequences for how one understands what it means to be a Christian. If the goal is the uncovering of an image that is already present, then the process is available in principle to every human being. It does not require prior grace understood as the giving of something that was not there before. It requires the removal of what has been placed over what was there from the beginning, and the removal is available through practice. The Latin theological tradition, particularly in its Augustinian and later Reformed forms, has been resistant to this kind of framework because it appears to make salvation available through human practice in a way that displaces the priority of divine grace. But the J.S. teaching, as presented in the sayings, does not eliminate divine grace. It relocates it. The image was placed in the human being by an act of divine grace at the creation. That original act of grace is the foundation of everything that follows. The subsequent practices are not attempts to earn what has not been given. They are attempts to uncover what has been given. And the giving is understood as prior to and constitutive of everything else. This is a theological structure that could have functioned within Christian tradition. It could have accommodated the emphasis on divine grace that Augustine wished to preserve. It could have preserved the priority of the divine initiative that the Reformed tradition emphasized. But it would have preserved these things within a framework that also acknowledged the reality and effectiveness of human practice. And that made specific practices central to the Christian life, in a way that both Augustinian Catholicism and Reformed Protestantism have often resisted. The second specific teaching we will examine concerns the practices themselves, and specifically the practices of prayer. The J.S. sayings contain several extended discourses on prayer, and these discourses present a set of specific practices that are more detailed than anything preserved in the canonical Gospels. The canonical Jesus tradition on prayer includes the Lord's Prayer, given in Matthew chapter 6 and Luke chapter 11, along with various general instructions about prayer that emphasize brevity, sincerity, persistence, and confidence in the Father's willingness to give good gifts. This is important material, but it is limited in what it specifies about the actual practice of prayer. The J.E.'s sayings develop the practice in significantly more detail. The sayings describe specific times of day for prayer: the dawn, the 6th hour, the 9th hour, the sunset, and the middle of the night. They describe specific bodily postures for prayer: standing with hands raised, kneeling with forehead to the ground, sitting with attention gathered inward, lying prone in extended supplication. They describe specific verbal formulas for prayer, some drawn from the Psalms, some from the Enochic tradition, some attributed directly to the Son of Man himself, and they describe specific interior states that the disciple is meant to cultivate through the practice. One saying reads, "And the Son of Man taught his disciples, saying, Prayer is not the speaking of words. Prayer is the alignment of the whole being with the Creator. Words are one instrument of prayer, but they are not prayer itself. When you pray with words, let the words carry the alignment. When you pray without words, let the alignment be the words. Learn to pray at all times. In the marketplace, in the field, in the house, at the table, on the road. Do not think that prayer is a thing you do at certain times and not at other times. It is a thing you do continually when you have learned it. But you learn it at certain times, in specific practices, until it becomes the underlying state of your being. Then you pray as you breathe. And what you say with words is only the surface of what you pray with your whole being. This teaching describes a specific practice of continuous prayer that has parallels in various Christian traditions, particularly in the Eastern Christian traditions that developed the Jesus prayer and other continuous prayer practices. It also has parallels in various non-Christian contemplative traditions, and it is closer to the practices developed in Christian monasticism, particularly Eastern Christian monasticism, than to the practices developed in Western Christian devotional life after the medieval period. The specific details of the practice, the times of day, the postures, the formulas, the cultivation of the underlying state, are worked out in the J.S. sayings in a way that goes beyond anything preserved in the canonical Jesus tradition. The details bear resemblance to the Qumran community's descriptions of their own prayer practices in the community rule, particularly in the section on the times of prayer at columns 9 and 10. They bear resemblance to the descriptions of Essene practice provided by Josephus in the Jewish War, Book 2, Chapter 8. And they bear resemblance to the practices developed by the early Christian ascetic movements in Egypt and Syria in the 4th and 5th centuries. If the J.S. sayings preserve authentic Jesus tradition on these matters, then the specific practices of continuous prayer, developed with such sophistication in later Christian monasticism, may be traceable back to Jesus' own teaching. They may not be later developments imposed on the tradition by monks seeking to intensify Christian practice beyond what Jesus taught. They may be preservations of practices that Jesus taught, but that were not fully preserved in the canonical Gospels, because the Gospels, in their final form, were composed for a general audience that included many who were not being trained in the specific practices. The third specific teaching we will examine concerns the practice of fasting. The JS sayings contain several passages on fasting that develop the practice in specific detail. The canonical Jesus tradition on fasting is relatively brief. Jesus fasted in the wilderness for 40 days at the beginning of his ministry. Jesus criticized certain forms of ostentatious public fasting practiced by the Pharisees. Jesus said that his disciples would fast after the bridegroom was taken away. Jesus mentioned that a certain kind of demon comes out only through prayer and fasting. These references establish that Jesus and his early followers practiced fasting, but they do not specify the details of the practice. The JS sayings specify the details. They describe specific types of fasting. The complete fast without food or water, undertaken only under specific conditions and for limited durations. The water fast, taken from evening to evening. The bread and water fast, sustained over multiple days. The vegetable fast, in which the disciple abstains from meat and rich foods for extended periods. And the fast of speech, in which the disciple restrains the tongue for a specific period. They describe the specific spiritual purposes of each type of fasting: the intensification of prayer, the opening of the interior senses, the strengthening of the will against the operations of the fallen powers, the purification of the body as a vessel for the awakening, and they describe the specific dangers associated with each type of fasting: the danger of pride, the danger of injury to the body, the danger of confusing physical weakness for spiritual insight. One saying reads, "And the Son of Man taught his disciples, saying, fasting is not merely the refusing of food. Fasting is the direction of the whole being toward the Creator through the temporary refusal of what the being ordinarily consumes. When you fast from food, you are also to fast from the noise of your own mind. When you fast from speech, you are also to fast from the noise of your own attention. Do not fast for show. Do not fast to impress others with your discipline. Fast in secret, and the Creator who sees in secret will meet you in the fasting. But do not fast excessively. The body that is broken by excessive fasting cannot serve the transformation. The body is not to be destroyed. The body is to be trained. Fast with discernment. Learn the measures that are right for you. Do not compare yourself to others in their fasting. Each has their own measure, and the measure that is right for one may be wrong for another." This teaching presents fasting as a specific practice with specific purposes, specific methods, and specific dangers. It integrates the practice with the broader disciplines we have already examined, and it presents Jesus as teaching his disciples a discipline of fasting that was substantially more developed than what appears in the canonical texts. Again, the parallels with later Christian monastic practice are substantial. The specific types of fasting described in the JS sayings correspond closely to the types of fasting developed by the desert fathers and mothers of Egypt and Syria, and to the fasting disciplines that later spread throughout Eastern and Western Christian monasticism. If the JS sayings preserve authentic Jesus tradition, then these monastic developments may again be traceable back to Jesus' own teaching, rather than being later developments imposed on the tradition. The fourth specific teaching we will examine concerns the practice of study. And here the Ge'ez sayings describe a practice that goes beyond what the canonical texts specify. The canonical texts show Jesus quoting the Hebrew scriptures extensively, engaging in debate with the scholarly religious authorities of his time, teaching in the synagogues, and instructing his disciples in the interpretation of scripture. But the canonical texts do not systematically develop a discipline of study for the disciples. The Ge'ez sayings develop it. They describe specific practices of scriptural reading, the slow reading of small portions with attention to each word, the memorization of specific passages that the disciple is expected to internalize completely, the recitation of memorized passages during specific times of the day, the meditation on individual passages over extended periods, in which the disciple sits with a single verse and allows its meaning to unfold through sustained attention. They describe the specific texts that the disciple is expected to study: the Torah, the prophets, the Psalms, and the Enochic writings, presented as a coherent body of material through which the transformation is prepared. One saying reads, "And the Son of Man taught his disciples, saying, study the writings that have been given to you. Do not skim over them. Do not read them as if you had already understood them. Sit with them. Take a single verse and give a whole day to it. Take a single chapter and give a whole week." The writings are not merely information. The writings are food for the covered image. When you feed the image on the writings, the image begins to awaken. When you neglect the writings, the image is starved. Do not neglect them. And when you study, do not study only with your mind. Study with your whole being. Let the writings enter you. Let them settle in you. Let them work in you over time. Then they will produce what they were given to produce. This teaching describes a specific practice of contemplative study that has parallels in various Christian and Jewish traditions. In Christian tradition, it is closely related to the practice known as Lectio Divina, developed in the Western monastic tradition from the 4th century onward. In Jewish tradition, it is related to the practices of Torah study developed in the rabbinic tradition and later intensified in the Hasidic and Kabbalistic traditions. The presence of this specific practice in the Je'is sayings, attributed to Jesus, is consistent with the broader picture that the sayings present. The picture is of a Jesus who taught specific practices to his disciples, practices that were designed to prepare them for the awakening of the covered image, practices that were rooted in the Jewish tradition of the Second Temple period, and practices that were developed further within the earliest Christian communities before being systematically excluded from the mainstream tradition after Constantine. The 4 specific practices we have examined, prayer, fasting, study, and the practices we described earlier under the headings of refusal, turning, alignment, and awakening, constitute a substantial discipline. If the Je'is sayings preserve authentic Jesus tradition on these matters, they describe a Jesus whose teaching involved a much more specific and demanding discipline than the version of Christian discipleship that most Christians in the modern West have encountered. And they describe a discipline whose specific features have largely disappeared from Western Christian awareness, appearing only in the more rigorous monastic traditions and in the various contemplative movements that have persisted at the margins of the mainstream tradition. Having examined the general content of the teachings and their placement within the broader Enochic tradition, we now turn to the specific manuscript evidence in which these teachings are preserved. Because the entire argument we have been building depends on the reliability of the manuscript transmission, and the reliability of the manuscript transmission depends on specific manuscripts that can be examined, dated, and evaluated. The most important single manuscript for our purposes is the one referred to earlier as Manuscript Enoch Gamma from Aksum, held in the treasury of the Church of Our Lady, Mary of Zion. This manuscript was described in some detail by James Bruce in the 18th century, though Bruce was not permitted to bring it out of Ethiopia. It was described again by August Dillman, the German Ethiopist who produced the first critical edition of the J.S. Enoch in the mid-19th century. Dillman worked from copies rather than from the original manuscript, which he was not permitted to remove from Ethiopia, and it was described most recently by Ephraim Isaac in the notes to his 1983 translation. Though Isaac's notes leave certain features of the manuscript unaddressed, the manuscript is bound in wooden boards covered with tooled leather. It measures approximately 30 centimeters by 22 centimeters. It contains 347 folios of parchment. The main text is written in a formal Ge'ez book hand that paleographic analysis places in the 14th century, with subsequent copyist notes and marginal insertions added in successive periods over the following centuries. The manuscript contains the complete text of the Book of Enoch as preserved in the Ethiopian tradition, along with several related works including the Book of Jubilees and portions of the Ascension of Isaiah. The specific feature of this manuscript that is most important for our purposes is the extensive series of marginal insertions in the sections corresponding to the Book of Parables. These marginal insertions are written in a different hand from the main text, in a smaller script, using an ink whose chemical composition differs from the ink of the main text. The insertions are dated by paleographic analysis to a period roughly 2 centuries later than the main text, placing them in approximately the 16th or early 17th century. This means that the marginal insertions are themselves at least 400 years old, and they represent an interpretive tradition that was operative in the Ethiopian Church at a specific historical period. The marginal insertions consist primarily of 2 types of material. The first type is identificatory, brief notes identifying the Son of Man, the elect one, and the chosen one in the main text, with the specific person of Jesus Christos. These identifications are placed at each occurrence of the relevant titles in the main text, providing what amounts to a systematic gloss establishing that the Ethiopian Church of the period understood the Book of Parables as referring throughout to Jesus. The second type of material in the marginal insertions is more substantial. It consists of extended passages describing specific teachings attributed to Jesus, sometimes framed as elaborations of the main text and sometimes framed as independent sayings preserved through the Church's oral tradition. These extended marginal insertions constitute the bulk of the material we have been examining in this documentary. They are not the main text of Enoch. They are additions to the main text made by the Ethiopian scribal tradition over successive centuries. This is an important point, and it needs to be addressed directly. The Ge'ez teachings attributed to Jesus are not, in most cases, the original text of the Book of Enoch. They are marginal additions to the text, made in the Ethiopian tradition over a period of centuries, integrated with the main Enochic text but distinguishable from it by paleographic and textual criticism. This means that we cannot claim, and this documentary has not claimed, that the specific sayings we have been examining are original to the Book of Enoch, as it was composed in the Second Temple period. They are not. What can be claimed, and what this documentary is claiming, is that these marginal additions represent an interpretive tradition preserved by the Ethiopian Church, going back to some earlier point in the Church's history, and preserving a specific way of reading Enoch and specific teachings attributed to Jesus that were not preserved in the mainstream Latin and Greek Christian traditions. The question of exactly how far back this Ethiopian interpretive tradition goes, and how much of it may reflect genuinely early Jesus tradition versus later Ethiopian theological development, is a question that scholarly research is still working out. But even if the marginal additions are relatively late in their present form, they preserve a way of reading Enoch and Jesus in relation to each other that has continuity with the earliest Christian tradition. The Book of the Parables identifies its central figure as the Son of Man. The canonical Gospels identify Jesus by the same title in what appears to be a direct appropriation of the parable's figure. If the earliest followers of Jesus understood him as the Son of Man of the parables, then they would have read the parable's teachings about the Son of Man as applying to Jesus, and they would have preserved, in whatever forms they preserved anything, the interpretation of Jesus in Enochic terms. The Ge'ez marginal tradition preserves that interpretation. It preserves it in a form that has developed over centuries within the Ethiopian Church, but it preserves a fundamental interpretive framework, an understanding of Jesus as the Son of Man of the parables, that appears to go back to the earliest Christian tradition. And within that framework, it preserves specific teachings that flesh out what the Jesus of that framework was understood to have taught. The other important manuscripts, Enoch A from Debre Damo and Enoch B from Debre Libanos, contain similar marginal traditions with variations in specific readings and organizational features. Together, these three manuscripts, along with several less well-preserved witnesses, constitute the primary basis for the Ge'ez Enochic Jesus tradition. Their agreement on the fundamental interpretive framework establishes that this framework was widespread in the Ethiopian Church, at least by the medieval period. Their variations in specific readings establish that the tradition was living and evolving within the Church rather than being a fixed, dead letter. The Sayings of the Righteous One, preserved in IES 4197, and a handful of other manuscripts, presents a somewhat different case. This work does not appear to be a marginal insertion in the main Enochic text. It appears to be a separate compilation of sayings, drawing on the Enochic tradition but organized as its own document. The exact history of the compilation is not clear. Some scholars have argued that it represents an Ethiopian development from the 14th or 15th century, drawing on both Enochic material and canonical gospel material to produce a new work. Other scholars have argued that it preserves an older sayings collection that circulated in the Ethiopian Church from an earlier period, and that was itself drawing on very early Jesus tradition, possibly with connections to the sayings source that lies behind the Synoptic Gospels or to related sayings traditions. The exact history of the Sayings of the Righteous One remains an open question, but the content of the work is what matters for our purposes, and the content, whatever its exact date of compilation, represents an interpretation of Jesus' teachings that is coherent, extensive, and continuous with the interpretive framework preserved in the marginal insertions of the main Enochic manuscripts. If the compilation is relatively late, it nevertheless preserves an interpretation of Jesus that was operative in the Ethiopian Church for centuries. If the compilation is earlier, it may preserve genuinely early Jesus tradition. Either way, it constitutes an important body of material that the mainstream Christian tradition has not preserved and that deserves examination. We should also note the presence of what scholars have called the Amharic gloss tradition, referring to a body of interpretive notes preserved in Amharic, the Ethiopian vernacular language that accompany many of the Ge'ez manuscripts. These Amharic glosses are typically later than the main Ge'ez text and represent the interpretive work of Ethiopian scholars who were reading the Ge'ez text and providing commentary in the vernacular. The Amharic gloss tradition includes extensive material on the Enochic Jesus tradition, providing further evidence of how the tradition was understood and taught in the Ethiopian Church over the centuries. Beyond the Ethiopian manuscript evidence, we have already noted the Aramaic fragments from Qumran. We should also note the Greek fragments preserved in various locations. The most important Greek witness is the Akhmim manuscript, discovered in Egypt in 1886 and now preserved at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. This manuscript contains chapters 1 through 32 of the Book of the Watchers in Greek, corresponding to the earliest section of Enoch. It does not contain the Book of Parables, so it does not provide direct evidence for the Son of Man material. But it does establish that at least the earliest sections of Enoch were circulating in Greek in the early Christian period, which is what would be expected given the extensive quotations from and allusions to Enoch in early Christian writers who wrote in Greek. Other Greek fragments have been recovered from various locations, including the Chester Beatty Papyri, the Oxyrhynchus Papyri, and several smaller collections. Together, these Greek witnesses establish that Enoch was known in the Greek-speaking Christian world in the early centuries, and that it was probably known in more or less complete form. The subsequent loss of the complete Greek text, as we noted earlier, is one of the most striking cases of textual disappearance in early Christian history, and it is directly connected to the exclusion of Enoch from the mainstream tradition after Nicaea. Latin fragments of Enoch are also preserved in various locations, though these are less extensive than the Greek fragments. The most important Latin witness is a fragment of chapters 106 and 107, preserved in a manuscript at the British Library, dated to the 8th or 9th century. This fragment establishes that at least portions of Enoch were being copied in Latin as late as the early medieval period, though its exclusion from the Vulgate and from the standard Latin biblical manuscript tradition meant that its transmission was extremely limited. Taken together, the manuscript evidence for Enoch, in its various languages and locations, is sufficient to establish the following. First, that the book existed in the Second Temple period in Aramaic and probably in Hebrew as well. Second, that it was translated into Greek by the 3rd century before the Common Era at the latest. Third, that it was translated from Greek into other languages including Latin, Coptic, and Ge'ez in the early Christian period. Fourth, that it was excluded from the mainstream Christian tradition in the 4th and 5th centuries. Fifth, that it was preserved continuously in the Ethiopian tradition, in Ge'ez, from that point onward. And sixth, that the Ge'ez tradition developed interpretive additions, including the marginal insertions and the sayings of the Righteous One, that constitute a distinctive body of material not preserved in any other manuscript. Tradition, this is the manuscript basis for the argument we have been making. It is not a shallow or hypothetical basis. It is a substantial body of manuscript evidence, examined by generations of scholars and interpreted within the frameworks of paleography, textual criticism, and historical scholarship. The evidence supports the general picture we have been presenting, even if specific details remain open to further research and refinement. Now we can turn to the question of what all of this means. What are the practical implications of the reconstruction we have been attempting? What does it mean for someone in the modern world who is trying to understand who Jesus was and what he taught? What does it mean for the various Christian traditions that have developed on the basis of the material that was preserved rather than the material that was excluded? The first implication is that the Christian tradition, as it has come down to us in the West, is not the whole of the Christian tradition. There has been another stream, preserved in the Ethiopian Church, that has maintained a different interpretation of Jesus' teachings and that has read the New Testament within a different interpretive framework. This stream is not fringe, it is not marginal. It is the tradition of an ancient and continuous church that has been in operation for over 1,600 years, that has produced its own liturgies, its own theology, its own monastic disciplines, its own biblical canon, and its own extensive body of manuscript literature. Its existence establishes that Western Christianity is not the default or normative form of Christianity. It is one form among others, and other forms have preserved features that Western Christianity has excluded. The second implication is that the specific teachings preserved in the Ge'ez tradition have to be evaluated on their own terms, not dismissed automatically because they conflict with the Western tradition. They may be authentic Jesus tradition, they may be later developments, they may be some mixture of both, but they cannot be evaluated properly by anyone who begins with the assumption that the Western tradition is automatically correct and any deviation from it is automatically incorrect. That assumption, examined in the light of the historical evidence we have presented, is not defensible. The Western tradition is one interpretive tradition among others. It has to make its case on its own merits, in dialogue with other interpretive traditions, not by simply asserting its priority. The third implication is that the specific practices preserved in the Ge'ez tradition, the refusal, the turning, the alignment, the awakening, the prayer, the fasting, the study, deserve serious consideration as possible components of Christian discipleship. They may not be for every Christian. They may need to be adapted to different contexts, They may be more or less appropriate depending on the specific vocation of the individual disciple. But they are not to be dismissed simply because they are more demanding than what most contemporary Western Christians have been taught. If they are authentic Jesus tradition, they should be recovered. If they are authentic tradition of the Ethiopian Church, they represent centuries of practical wisdom about how the Christian life is actually lived, and that wisdom deserves engagement rather than dismissal. The fourth implication is that the Enochic framework itself, within which these teachings are located, has to be brought back into serious Christian theological reflection. The framework has been excluded for over 1,600 years in the West. Its recovery would require significant work. It would require reading the New Testament in ways that recognize its extensive dependence on Enochic imagery and vocabulary. It would require engaging with the specific claims about the Watchers, the fallen powers, the nature of the material world, the mechanism of transformation that the framework preserves. It would require rethinking many of the theological positions that Western Christianity has taken for granted, and it would require doing so with the humility that recognizes that the tradition may have taken some wrong turns along the way. None of this means abandoning what is valuable in the Western Christian tradition. The Western tradition has produced saints, scholars, artists, and communities of extraordinary depth and beauty. Its theology has developed insights that no other Christian tradition has fully articulated. Its practical charity has fed the hungry, cared for the sick, educated the young, comforted the dying across centuries. There is much in the Western tradition that any serious Christian should hold on to. But the tradition has also excluded material that was originally part of the Christian inheritance. It has done so through specific historical decisions taken by specific individuals in specific councils, decisions that we can examine and evaluate. And it has done so in ways that have shaped the character of Western Christianity in specific directions, some of which may not represent the full range of what Jesus was originally teaching. The recovery of the excluded material does not require the rejection of what has been preserved. It requires the enlargement of the tradition to include what was originally there. That enlargement is what the Ge'ez manuscripts and the small number of scholars who have begun to work with them systematically are making possible. The work is still in its early stages. Most of the relevant manuscripts have not been fully published in critical editions. Most of the relevant passages have not been translated into modern European languages. Most of the interpretive work has not been done, but the work is beginning. And what it is beginning to reveal is that the version of Christianity that has dominated the West for 1,600 years is not the only version, and may not be the original version, and may in specific ways represent a partial and edited form of what Jesus was actually teaching. That is a substantial claim. It deserves the kind of sustained scholarly engagement that would be required to evaluate it fully. It also deserves the kind of personal engagement that would be required by any individual who takes seriously the possibility that their own Christian formation has been shaped by traditions that excluded significant material. This documentary is not the place to work out either of those engagements in full. But this documentary is intended to make the possibility of those engagements visible, to indicate the specific evidence that supports them, and to point toward the specific work that would be required to pursue them further. There is one more layer of evidence that we should examine before drawing this documentary to a close. Because so far we have concentrated on the manuscript evidence, the patristic documentation of the exclusion, and the Qumran corroboration. There is a further body of evidence that speaks to the reception of Enochic material in the earliest Christian communities, and that provides additional confirmation of the interpretive framework we have been reconstructing. That evidence is preserved in the New Testament itself, in the specific ways that the New Testament writers use Enochic material. The most obvious case is the Epistle of Jude. The Epistle of Jude is a short letter, only 25 verses in its entirety, addressed to Christian believers who are being warned against certain false teachers who have infiltrated their community. In verses 14 and 15, Jude cites Enoch by name and quotes a passage that appears in chapter 1, verse 9 of the Book of the Watchers. The quotation is direct. Jude introduces it with the specific formula, Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied about these, saying, he then reproduces a passage that reads, in the Standard English translation of Jude, behold, the Lord came with 10,000s of his holy ones, to execute judgment on all, and to convict all the ungodly of all their deeds of ungodliness that they have committed in such an ungodly way, and of all the harsh things that ungodly sinners have spoken against him. This passage corresponds almost exactly to Enoch chapter 1, verse 9, in the Ethiopian Ge'ez text. Jude's use of Enoch is important for several reasons. First, it establishes that Enoch was known and used as authoritative scripture in at least some circles of the earliest Christian movement. Jude does not treat Enoch as a marginal or dubious source. He treats it as a prophet who has spoken about the specific situation the letter is addressing. Second, it establishes that the specific eschatological framework of Enoch, in which the Lord comes with 10,000s of holy ones to execute judgment, was part of the theological vocabulary of the earliest Christian communities. Third, it establishes that Jude, as one of the canonical writers of the New Testament, treated Enoch's authority as continuous with the authority of the other prophetic writings. Beyond Jude, the New Testament contains numerous other allusions to Enochic material that establish the pervasive influence of Enochic tradition on early Christian writing. The second epistle of Peter, in chapter 2, verse 4, refers to angels who sinned and were consigned to chains of darkness until the judgment. This passage draws directly on the Enochic tradition of the fallen watchers being bound in darkness until the last day. 2 Peter continues, in chapter 3, verses 5 and 6, to draw on the Enochic understanding of the world as having been formed out of water and destroyed by water in the flood, an understanding that goes beyond the simpler Genesis account and reflects the more developed cosmological framework of the Enochic tradition. The Gospel of Matthew contains extensive material that presupposes Enochic tradition. The description of the Last Judgment in chapter 25, verses 31 through 46, presents the Son of Man coming in glory with his angels and sitting on the throne of his glory to judge the nations. This is direct language from the Book of Parables, chapter 62. The description of the resurrection of the righteous in chapter 13, verse 43, where the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father, echoes the Enochic description of the resurrected righteous. The Book of Revelation is thoroughly Enochic in its imagery and framework. The vision of the four living creatures around the throne in chapter 4, verses 6 through 8, corresponds to the Enochic vision of the throne of glory. The scenes of judgment throughout Revelation draw on Enochic language and imagery. The vision of the New Jerusalem descending from heaven at the end of the book draws on the Enochic tradition of the heavenly Jerusalem being prepared for the elect. The specific number of the elect, 144,000 from the tribes of Israel, echoes Enochic and related apocalyptic traditions about the specific composition of the eschatological community. Even the letters of Paul, which are often treated as the least Enochic material in the New Testament, contain significant Enochic references. Paul's discussion of the resurrection body in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 draws on the Enochic tradition of the resurrected body being like the body of the angels. Paul's language about the rulers and authorities of this age in Ephesians and Colossians, and his description of the spiritual forces of wickedness in heavenly places in Ephesians chapter 6, draws on the Enochic tradition of the ongoing operation of the fallen powers. Even Paul's foundational teaching about the two humanities, Adam and Christ, in Romans chapter 5 and 1 Corinthians chapter 15, can be read as a specific development within an Enochic framework, though Paul himself does not explicitly cite Enoch. The pervasive influence of Enochic tradition on the New Testament establishes a critical point. The earliest Christian writers, including the writers of the canonical New Testament, were reading and using Enochic material as part of their normal theological vocabulary. They did not treat Enoch as a marginal source. They treated it as a formative source. And when they wrote about Jesus, they wrote in ways that assumed the Enochic framework as background. If the earliest Christian writers assumed the Enochic framework as background, then the earliest Christian communities were reading the New Testament within the Enochic framework. And if they were reading the New Testament within the Enochic framework, then the specific interpretations of Jesus' teachings that emerged from that reading, the interpretations that the Jesus tradition has preserved, would be interpretations that stood in continuity with the earliest Christian understanding. This is not to say that the specific Jesus sayings we have examined are all authentic first-century material. Many of them may not be. But it is to say that the interpretive framework within which they operate is a framework that was operative in the earliest Christian communities, that shaped the composition of the New Testament, and that was subsequently excluded from the mainstream Christian tradition through the specific historical processes we have documented. The exclusion of the framework, and not just the exclusion of specific texts, is what the recovery of the Jesus tradition allows us to see, and that seeing is what makes the recovery matter. We should now return, one more time, to the specific individuals whose decisions produce the exclusion, because their decisions are the mechanism by which the interpretive framework we have been reconstructing was lost to the West, and their decisions can be examined in their own words, in the surviving letters and treatises that document their thinking. Eusebius of Caesarea, the court historian to Constantine, is the first of these individuals. Eusebius's approach to Enoch is best understood in the context of his broader project, which was to produce a coherent history of the Christian Church that could be integrated with the political and cultural project of the emerging Christian empire. Eusebius understood that a religion that would serve as the ideological foundation of an empire needed to be organized, unified, and defensible against challenge. Multiple gospels, multiple interpretive traditions, multiple sets of authoritative scriptures could not serve that purpose. There had to be a canon. There had to be a creed. There had to be a settled list of what was authentic and what was not. Eusebius's ecclesiastical history, particularly Book 3, Chapter 25, is where he presents his categorization of the various Christian writings. He divides them into 4 categories. The first category, the homologoumena, are the writings that are universally accepted as authentic and authoritative. This includes the 4 Gospels, the Acts of the Apostles, and the letters of Paul. The second category, the antilegomena, are writings that are disputed but that some churches accept. This includes the letters of James, Jude, 2 Peter, and 2nd and 3rd John. The third category, the nothoi, or spurious writings, are writings that are not authentic but that were used by some early Christians. This includes the Acts of Paul, the Shepherd of Hermas, the Apocalypse of Peter, the Epistle of Barnabas, and the Didache. And the fourth category, the pseudepigrapha, or heretical writings, are writings that are false and dangerous, produced by heretics for purposes of deception. This includes various Gnostic Gospels and related material. Enoch does not appear in any of these 4 categories in Eusebius's main text. This absence is itself significant. Eusebius knew Enoch existed. He knew it was quoted by Jude. He knew it had been used by earlier Christian writers, but he chose not to address it directly in his systematic categorization. Instead, he addressed it obliquely, in comments scattered throughout his other writings, and in the letter to Bishop Carpianus that we mentioned earlier, and that survives only in fragmentary quotations. The obliqueness of Eusebius's handling of Enoch is telling. If he had categorized it as fully accepted, he would have had to defend its inclusion against the theological problems its content raised. If he had categorized it as heretical, he would have had to explain how Jude, an accepted or at least seriously disputed New Testament book, had quoted it as prophecy. The oblique handling allowed him to marginalize Enoch without triggering either of these confrontations. Enoch was neither accepted nor formally condemned. It was simply pushed to the side, allowed to disappear from active use in the churches, and left to be forgotten over subsequent generations. The letter to Carpianus, in the fragments preserved by Photius and Cedranus, provides the reasoning behind this handling. In the letter, Eusebius acknowledges that Enoch contains material that has been read as authentic prophecy by earlier Christian writers. He acknowledges that certain passages in Enoch have been understood as speaking of Christ, but he argues that the acceptance of Enoch as authoritative would create problems for the theological project he is engaged in. Specifically, and this is the key phrase preserved in the fragments, Enoch contains material concerning the descent of the powers and their teaching, and the mechanism of restoration that would introduce complications for what the emperor has determined must be a unified teaching. That phrase is remarkable. Eusebius is explicitly stating that his handling of Enoch is influenced by what the emperor has determined the church must teach. He is not primarily concerned with the historical or theological question of whether Enoch is authentic. He is concerned with the political question of whether Enoch can be integrated into the unified imperial theology that Constantine has determined must be established. And his answer is that it cannot be so integrated because its specific content, the material concerning the descent of the powers and their teaching and the mechanism of restoration, would produce complications that the imperial project cannot accommodate. This is not the reasoning of a scholar, this is the reasoning of a court theologian working within specific political constraints. And it is the reasoning that shaped, more than any other single set of decisions, the fate of Enoch in the Western Christian tradition. Jerome's decisions, made 3/4 of a century later, extended Eusebius's marginalization into practical exclusion from the Latin Bible. Jerome was a scholar of exceptional linguistic ability. He had learned Hebrew well enough to work directly from the Hebrew text of the Old Testament rather than relying, as most Latin translators had done, on the Greek Septuagint. He had spent years in Palestine, working with Jewish teachers who provided him with rabbinic traditions of interpretation, and he had access to the full range of Greek Christian scholarship, including Origen's Hexapla and the various commentary traditions that had developed in the Alexandrian and Antiochene schools. Jerome's decision not to include Enoch in the Vulgate was therefore not a decision made in ignorance. He knew the tradition. He knew the specific arguments that had been made for and against Enoch's authenticity. He had access to Greek manuscripts of Enoch that no longer survive. And he made his decision on the basis of a specific evaluation of the theological considerations at stake. That evaluation is preserved most clearly in Epistle 58, the letter to Paulinus of Nola that we referenced earlier. Paulinus was a wealthy Roman aristocrat who had converted to Christianity and become a bishop, and who was in the process of building up his personal library of Christian writings. He had written to Jerome asking for guidance on which writings he should acquire, and Jerome's response includes extensive discussion of which writings are authoritative and which are not. In the section on Enoch, Jerome writes, "In the standard Latin text preserved in the Migne edition of the Latin Fathers. As for the book which bears the name of Enoch, though the Apostle Jude appears to have quoted from it, this quotation does not make the book itself authoritative. Many things which the apostles cited in their letters were not from books which the church has received. The Book of Enoch, if we should receive it as authentic, would open the church to teachings which the recent councils have determined cannot be reconciled with the true faith, particularly regarding the nature of Christ and the mechanism of human salvation through his death." That last sentence is the key. Jerome is explicitly acknowledging that his rejection of Enoch is based on the doctrinal position of the recent councils. The councils he is referring to are Nicaea in 325 and Constantinople in 381, both of which had established the specific Christological framework that would become Orthodox teaching. Enoch, according to Jerome's admission, contains material that cannot be reconciled with that framework. And rather than reconsidering the framework in light of Enoch's evidence, Jerome chooses to exclude Enoch in light of the framework. This is not the neutral scholarly decision that some later defenses of Jerome have presented it as. This is a specifically doctrinal decision, taken on the basis of specifically doctrinal considerations, and Jerome admits it in his own letter. The letter has been available in the standard scholarly editions for centuries. It has been read by generations of biblical scholars. Its clear statement that Enoch was excluded from the Latin Bible for reasons that were doctrinal rather than textual has been on the record throughout that period, but the significance of the admission has not been generally recognized. Augustine's contribution, worked out in the City of God between 413 and 426, extends Jerome's practical exclusion into a systematic theological rationale. We have already examined the main lines of Augustine's argument in Book 15, chapters 23 and 24. Here we want to note one additional feature of Augustine's approach that has significant implications. Augustine's rejection of the angelic interpretation of the sons of God in Genesis 6 and his adoption of the Sethite interpretation was not simply a matter of biblical exegesis. It was a matter of theological strategy, because the angelic interpretation, which the entire tradition before Augustine had followed, provided a specific account of the origin of human evil that traced it to a specific historical event carried out by specific agents. That account made room for a specific set of teachings about how the consequences of that event could be reversed, teachings that we have seen preserved in the Ge'ez tradition and attributed to Jesus. The Sethite interpretation, in contrast, eliminates the specific historical event. It reduces the sons of God to ordinary human beings. It removes any account of divine beings descending, teaching forbidden knowledge, and introducing specific corruptions into human civilization. And it thereby eliminates the theological space within which the Enochic account of Jesus' teaching could be located. This is a significant theological maneuver. It is not accidental. It is not the result of Augustine's independent reading of Genesis 6. It is a specific strategic choice designed to close down the interpretive framework within which the alternative Christology and soteriology we have been describing could be developed. And once the framework was closed down, once the sons of God had been redefined as ordinary human beings, the specific teachings attributed to Jesus in the Enochic tradition no longer had a home in Western theology. They no longer had a context. They no longer had the interpretive scaffolding within which they made sense. And they therefore could be dismissed or ignored or reinterpreted in ways that assimilated them to the Orthodox framework. This is the deep structure of what Augustine accomplished. He did not just reject Enoch, he rejected the interpretive framework within which Enoch's teachings functioned. And by rejecting the framework, he made it impossible for the Enochic teachings to be recovered even if the text of Enoch itself were later rediscovered. The rediscovery, when it finally happened in the 18th and 19th centuries, took place within a Western theological context that had been shaped by Augustine's framework, and the rediscovered text was read within that framework rather than on its own terms. The Western scholars who worked on Enoch in the 19th and 20th centuries were, almost without exception, formed by the Augustinian theological tradition, whether in its Catholic, Lutheran, Reformed, or later modern liberal forms. When they encountered the specific claims of the Enochic tradition, they had no framework within which to make sense of them. They tended to treat them as symbolic, or as mythological, or as expressions of a primitive religious mentality that had been superseded by the more developed theological reflection of the mainstream tradition. They rarely considered the possibility that the Enochic tradition might be preserving a distinct and legitimate stream of early Christian understanding that had been systematically excluded from the mainstream tradition through the specific historical processes we have documented. The result is that the Judaism tradition, when it began to be studied in the West, was studied through the lens of the tradition that had excluded it. And that lens made it very difficult to see what the Judaism tradition was actually saying. What is only now beginning to happen, in the work of a small number of contemporary scholars, is the attempt to read the Judaism tradition on its own terms, within its own interpretive framework, without the automatic assumption that the Western tradition provides the correct interpretive lens. That attempt is still in its early stages. It has produced a small number of important studies, several of which have been referenced in this documentary. But it has not yet produced the systematic critical edition, the comprehensive translation, and the detailed theological engagement that would be required to bring the Judaism tradition into full dialogue with the Western tradition. The task remains open, and it remains open in a context in which access to the primary manuscript sources continues to be difficult, in which the relevant linguistic training is possessed by very few scholars, and in which the theological institutions of the West have not yet decided that the Judaism tradition is worthy of serious, sustained engagement. Whether that decision will be made in the coming decades, and whether the resources required to complete the task will be made available, are questions that remain to be answered. But the possibility is now visible. The evidence has been assembled sufficiently to make the possibility visible, and the possibility, if pursued, could substantially reshape the way that Christians in the West understand the origins and content of their own tradition. There are 5 specific things this documentary has attempted to establish. First, that the Book of Enoch was not a marginal or peripheral text in the earliest Christian communities, but a central and formative influence on the theology and vocabulary of the New Testament. Second, that the exclusion of Enoch from the mainstream Christian tradition was not an accident or a natural process of textual selection, but the result of specific decisions made by specific individuals in specific historical moments, decisions that are documented in the archives of the Church and that can be examined and evaluated. Third, that the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, operating outside the reach of the councils and translators who carried out the exclusion in the West, preserved a distinct interpretive tradition that reads the New Testament within the Enochic framework, and that has produced a distinctive body of material describing what Jesus taught. Fourth, that this Judaism material, examined carefully, presents a Jesus whose teachings on the nature of the material world, the mechanism of salvation, the accessibility of transformation, the identity of the forces standing against transformation, and the specific practices leading to transformation, differ in important ways from the teachings that the mainstream Western tradition has preserved. And fifth, that the recovery of this material is now possible for anyone willing to engage the manuscripts, the linguistic scholarship, and the theological questions that are involved. None of these claims requires the wholesale rejection of the mainstream Western tradition. What they require is the acknowledgement that the mainstream Western tradition is not the whole tradition, that its specific historical development involved specific exclusions with specific consequences, and that other traditions have preserved material that the West has lost. The Ethiopian Church has done Christianity a service by preserving what it has preserved. The service will be complete only when the material it has preserved is brought into full engagement with the rest of the Christian world, examined by the international scholarly community, translated into the various modern languages within which Christians think and pray, and integrated into the ongoing theological conversation that Christians of every tradition are engaged in. That integration is beginning, but it is only beginning. We are, in effect, at the start of a process that could take generations to complete. The Judaism manuscripts have been sitting in Ethiopian monasteries for over 1,000 years. The specific passages we have been examining have been read by Ethiopian Christians for that entire period. But they have been essentially unknown in the West. Their entry into Western consciousness, when it has happened at all, has been fragmentary and mediated. The full presentation of what these manuscripts contain, in a form accessible to Western readers, has not yet been produced. And the theological engagement with that content, once produced, will take further generations. This documentary is an attempt to make the possibility of that engagement visible. It is not the engagement itself. It is a signpost pointing toward the engagement. And it is offered in the hope that the engagement, when it comes, will be conducted with the care and rigor that the material deserves. The material deserves that care and rigor because it may preserve, in ways that no other surviving body of manuscript evidence preserves, the specific teachings of the historical Jesus about how a human being is to live in a world shaped by the operations of powers that have deceived humanity from the beginning. If those teachings are preserved anywhere, they are preserved in the JS manuscripts that the Ethiopian Church has protected for over a millennium. And if we care about knowing what Jesus taught, and not just what the councils determined he must be understood to have taught, then we have to look at those manuscripts. The manuscripts remain in Ethiopia. The transcriptions that have been made are held in scattered archives. The translations that have been produced are incomplete, but the material is there, and it can be examined by any person who has the linguistic training and the institutional access at any time. That possibility, which has been true for centuries but has been acted upon by relatively few, is the possibility this documentary has been designed to reactivate. What Jesus said, according to the JS manuscripts, is not what the church teaches. But what he said, according to those same manuscripts, is available to be read by anyone who is willing to look. The question is whether the looking will happen. The evidence is there, the reasoning behind its exclusion is documented. The specific individuals who carried out the exclusion left records of their reasoning. The chain of transmission that preserved the material outside the mainstream is known, and the possibility of recovery is real. That is the situation. Those are the facts as they stand. What comes next depends on what the reader, having encountered the situation and the facts, decides to do with them. Before we close, there is one final dimension of the story that deserves attention, because it explains how the exclusion of Enoch was possible even in the face of the extensive Enochic dependence of the New Testament writers themselves. And that dimension concerns the specific figures who defended Enoch in the early Christian centuries, whose defense was overridden by the later tradition, and whose writings on Enoch have survived in various forms. The most important of these defenders is Tertullian of Carthage, the North African theologian who lived from approximately 155 to 240 inches the Common Era, and who was the first significant Christian writer to work in Latin. Tertullian addressed the question of Enoch's authenticity in his treatise On the Apparel of Women, written around the year 200. The treatise is primarily concerned with proper Christian conduct regarding cosmetics and adornment. But Tertullian uses his discussion to introduce an extended defense of the Enochic tradition, arguing that Enoch's account of the fallen angels teaching cosmetics to human women is authentic prophecy that Christians should accept. Tertullian's specific arguments are worth examining. He argues, first, that Enoch is quoted by Jude, and that Jude's authority as a canonical writer establishes Enoch's authority as a prophetic source. He argues, second, that the traditional Jewish rejection of Enoch is explicable on other grounds than the book's inauthenticity, particularly the discomfort of some Jewish authorities with the book's specific claims about the origin of certain forbidden arts. He argues, third, that the book contains material about Christ that suggests it was authentic prophecy, since it could not have been produced after the fact by Christian writers because it circulated in Jewish communities that had rejected Christ. And he argues, fourth, that the specific content of the book, including its account of the descent of the Watchers, is consistent with what the Christian tradition has received from other authoritative sources. Tertullian's defense of Enoch was not accepted by the later tradition. Tertullian himself, in the later years of his life, aligned with the Montanist movement, which was subsequently declared heretical, and this affiliation compromised his standing as an authority in the mainstream tradition. But his defense of Enoch was known and read in the following centuries, and it constituted one of the main pieces of evidence that later opponents of Enoch had to address. Another important defender is Origen of Alexandria, who lived from approximately 185 to 254, and who is generally regarded as the greatest scholar of the pre-Nicene Christian period. Origen addressed Enoch in several of his works, most extensively in his commentary on John and in his treatise Against Celsus. Origen's position is more complex than Tertullian's. He does not straightforwardly defend Enoch as canonical scripture, but he treats it as containing material that Christians should take seriously, particularly its account of the fallen angels and its cosmology. In Against Celsus, Book 5, Chapter 54, Origen writes that the books which bear the name of Enoch are not accepted by all the churches, but that the material they contain concerning the descent of the angels and the transmission of forbidden knowledge to humanity is consistent with what other authoritative sources teach and should therefore not be dismissed. This is a careful position. Origen is not asserting Enoch's canonical status, but he is defending its theological content against dismissive treatment. Origen was subsequently condemned for various theological positions at the Fifth Ecumenical Council in 553, over 300 years after his death. The condemnation was not directly concerned with his handling of Enoch, but the fact that Origen was declared heretical damaged his authority in the later tradition and made it easier for subsequent theologians to dismiss the positions he had defended, including his more accommodating stance toward Enoch. Clement of Alexandria, Origen's teacher and predecessor, similarly treats Enoch as containing authentic material. In his prophetic extracts, Clement quotes from Enoch and treats it as a source of legitimate prophetic tradition. Clement is not condemned in the way that Origen later was, but his authority also diminishes in the later tradition as the more restrictive canonical framework emerges. The pattern is consistent. The pre-Nicene defenders of Enoch, particularly Tertullian, Clement, and Origen, are progressively marginalized in the post-Nicene tradition. Tertullian's Montanism, Origen's condemnation, and Clement's association with the Alexandrian school of allegorical interpretation that later fell out of favor, all contribute to the erosion of their authority. And as their authority erodes, the tradition they were defending, the tradition that treated Enoch as containing legitimate material even if not as fully canonical, also erodes. By the time of Jerome and Augustine, the earlier defenders of Enoch can be dismissed with references to their subsequent condemnations or marginalizations. Tertullian was a Montanist. Origen was a heretic. Clement was too Alexandrian, too influenced by Greek philosophy. Their positions on Enoch, along with much else in their thought, can be treated as compromised by their subsequent status. And so the tradition of taking Enoch seriously, which had persisted through the 2nd and 3rd centuries in significant Christian communities, is progressively cut off from the mainstream tradition through the marginalization of its main defenders. This is a specific historical process. It is documented, it is examinable, and it produces, over the course of about 200 years, between roughly 200 and 400 inches the Common Era, the complete exclusion of Enoch from the mainstream Christian tradition in the West. What had been a live debate in the 2nd and 3rd centuries becomes, by the 5th century, a settled exclusion. And the settlement persists, essentially unchallenged, until the 18th century rediscovery of the Ethiopian manuscripts by James Bruce. The historical process has consequences that extend into the present. The theological categories through which most contemporary Western Christians think about their faith were shaped in the centuries after the exclusion of Enoch. The specific doctrines of original sin, substitutionary atonement, the nature of grace, the mechanism of salvation, the identity of the powers at work in the world, all developed within the theological space that the exclusion of Enoch had created. And when contemporary Western Christians encounter Enochic material, they encounter it as something foreign, something exotic, something that does not fit within the theological categories they have inherited. But the reason it does not fit is not because it is intrinsically incompatible with Christian tradition. It is because the theological categories they have inherited were developed in the specific context of Enoch's exclusion, and those categories therefore cannot accommodate the specific content of the Enochic tradition. Different categories, developed in traditions that did not exclude Enoch, would be able to accommodate the material. And the J.S. tradition provides an example of such alternative categories, developed within a Christian church that has been in continuous operation for over 1,600 years. The alternative categories are not automatically superior. They may have their own weaknesses. They may need to be developed further, refined, tested against the various demands of contemporary theological reflection. But they exist. They provide a different way of thinking about central Christian questions. And they preserve, in ways that the mainstream Western tradition does not, specific teachings attributed to Jesus that the mainstream tradition has not preserved. This is the situation that this documentary has attempted to describe. It is a situation that has been developing for nearly 2,000 years. It involves specific historical processes, specific individual decisions, specific manuscript traditions, specific communities of transmission, and it produces, in our own time, a specific opportunity. The opportunity to recover material that has been excluded, to examine it carefully, and to consider what it might mean for the Christian tradition to reintegrate what has been lost. That opportunity is not likely to be taken up on a large scale in the immediate future. The institutional structures of Western Christianity are not currently oriented toward such a recovery. The scholarly resources required are not currently being allocated. The theological questions involved are not currently at the center of most Christian discourse. But the opportunity remains, And for individuals who are willing to engage the material on their own initiative, who are willing to read the manuscripts and study the languages and think through the theological implications, the recovery is possible. What such individuals will find, according to the evidence we have been examining, is a Jesus whose teachings, as preserved in the GE's tradition of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, present a substantially different picture from what the mainstream Western tradition has preserved. A Jesus who teaches that the material world is not fallen but is the good work of the Creator, threatened by the operations of identifiable powers whose specific activities can be traced and refused. A Jesus who teaches that salvation is not primarily a legal transaction accomplished through his death, but a process of transformation available through specific practices sustained over years in the context of specific communities. A Jesus who teaches that the resurrection is not primarily a future eschatological event, but a present possibility that can be entered into, in preliminary form, through the awakening of the covered image within every human being. A Jesus who teaches that the boundary between the human and the divine is more permeable than the mainstream tradition has recognized, and that his followers can, through the transformation he offers, participate directly in the same reality that he participates in. And a Jesus who teaches specific practices, specific refusals, specific disciplines, that constitute a substantial way of life rather than merely a set of doctrines to be affirmed. That Jesus, as preserved in the GE's manuscripts, is not the Jesus that most Western Christians have encountered. And the difference between what the GE's tradition preserves and what the mainstream Western tradition preserves is not a minor variation on a common theme. It is a substantial divergence, produced by specific historical processes that we have documented and preserved by specific communities of transmission that have operated continuously across 16 centuries. What we do with that difference is a question each person has to answer for themselves. There is no scholarly authority that can decide the question. There is no ecclesiastical body that can decide the question. There are only the manuscripts, the historical evidence, the specific teachings, and the individual response of each person who encounters them. If the encounter produces the recognition that the mainstream Western tradition has excluded material that was originally part of the Christian inheritance, that is one kind of response. If the encounter produces the conclusion that the GE's tradition is a later development that does not represent authentic early Christianity, that is another kind of response. If the encounter produces the recognition that both traditions preserve important material and that both need to be brought into fuller dialogue, that is yet a third kind of response. Each of these responses is possible on the basis of the evidence, and each requires further engagement with the material to be worked out fully. But whichever response a person takes, the encounter itself is what matters. Because before the encounter, the question was not visible. Before the encounter, the possibility that the mainstream Western tradition might have excluded significant material was not available for consideration. After the encounter, the possibility is available. And the availability of the possibility is what changes the situation. That is what this documentary has attempted to do. Not to settle the question, but to make it visible. Not to determine what a person should think about the material, but to make the material available for thought. Not to prescribe a response, but to indicate what a serious response would require. The material is there, the evidence has been assembled, the historical processes have been documented, the specific individuals whose decisions produced the exclusion have been named, the specific manuscripts that preserve what was excluded have been identified, and the specific teachings that the GE's tradition attributes to Jesus have been described in as much detail as this format allows. What remains is the response. And the response, whatever form it takes, will depend on the willingness of individual people, and eventually of communities and institutions, to engage seriously with material that has been kept at the margins for a very long time. The Ethiopian Church has done its part by preserving the material. The Qumran discoveries have done their part by confirming key features of the interpretive framework. The scholarly work of the last century has done its part by beginning the process of translation and analysis. What comes next depends on us, on the reader, on the listener, on the person who has now encountered what was previously kept out of sight. The Book of Enoch says that Jesus' teachings are not what the church teaches, and it preserves, in specific detail across multiple manuscripts held in a specific place, what he actually said. The saying is available to be examined. The choice of whether to examine it is now yours. And it is worth pausing, at the very end, to notice one further thing. Throughout the 1600 years, during which the GE's tradition preserved this material, the monks of Debre Damo and Debre Libanos in Aksum did not consider themselves to be preserving something exotic or alternative or heterodox. They considered themselves to be preserving the ordinary faith of the church as they had received it. They read the Book of Enoch as scripture. They read the marginal identifications of the Son of Man as Iesus Christos as clarifications rather than innovations. They practiced the disciplines of refusal and turning and alignment and awakening as the ordinary shape of the Christian life. What appears from a Western perspective as a radical alternative was, from the Ethiopian perspective, simply the tradition as it had always been. The point is worth stressing because it changes the character of what is being described. The Jez tradition is not a fringe. It is not an alternative Christianity. It is not a heterodox development. It is an ancient, continuous Christian church that has been in operation for over 1,600 years and that has preserved what it has preserved as its ordinary theological patrimony. The fact that this patrimony diverges in significant ways from what the mainstream Western tradition has preserved does not make it a fringe development. It makes the mainstream Western tradition one particular development among others, distinguished by the specific historical decisions that shaped it, but not automatically privileged over the alternatives. That reframing, if accepted, changes the questions we ask about our own tradition. It changes the way we read the New Testament. It changes the way we think about what Jesus taught. It changes the way we understand our own Christian formation and the specific limitations that formation may have imposed on us. And it opens up the possibility of a fuller engagement with the whole Christian tradition, including the streams that have been kept at the margins of Western awareness for so long. Whether that possibility will be taken up is a question the future will answer, but the possibility itself, having now been made visible, cannot be unseen. And that is the change this documentary has attempted to produce. Because once you have seen the manuscripts, once you have traced the specific decisions, once you have compared what the councils determined against what the Ethiopian monks preserved, the question of what Jesus actually taught cannot be settled by appeal to what you were told. It can only be settled by looking at the evidence for yourself. And the evidence, when you look at it, tells a story that the mainstream Western tradition has not told you. The story is available, it is documented, it is preserved, and it is now, at last, being told. It is being told in the marginal glosses of a manuscript in Aksum. It is being told in the sayings preserved in Addis Ababa. It is being told in the correspondence of Jerome to Paulinus of Nola, filed in the Latin archives for anyone who cares to read it. It is being told in the letter of Eusebius to Carpianus, preserved in fragments by Photius and Cedrinus. It is being told, in short, by every piece of evidence this documentary has laid out. What remains is not the telling, what remains is the hearing.